The storm came without much warning. By 7 that evening, the sky above Hargrove Regional Airport had turned the color of a bruise. That specific shade of greenish-black that pilots learn to respect and everyone else learns to fear too late. Rain hammered the tarmac in sheets so thick that the runway lights bled together into a single smear of orange and white. Wind gusts were clocking 43 miles per hour and climbing. The kind of night where sensible people stayed home, ordered something warm, and watched the weather radar refresh every 3 minutes on their phones. Elias Carter was not home. He was flat on his back underneath the belly of a Cessna Citation CJ-4, his work light clamped to a wheel strut, a socket wrench balanced on his chest, and cold water pooling in the hollow of his left ear. He'd been in that position for the better part of an hour, working through a hydraulic line inspection that his supervisor had technically assigned to someone else. Someone who had called in sick that afternoon, leaving the work order unsigned and the aircraft grounded. Elias had picked it up without being asked. That was the kind of thing he did. He was 32 years old, though most people who met him for the first time guessed older. Not because he looked worn down exactly, but because he carried himself with the specific quietness of a man who had stopped waiting for life to slow down and had simply learned to move through it differently. He had dark circles under his eyes that coffee no longer touched. His hands were calloused in the particular way that came from years of torque work and cold metal, the kind of hands that told a story his mouth rarely did. His ID badge read E. Carter, Aircraft Maintenance Technician, Level 3. The lanyard had a small plastic dinosaur clipped to it. His daughter, Maya, had put it there 6 months ago. He'd never taken it off. Across the airport, on the private aviation side, Tishore, separated from the commercial terminals by a fence line and about 200 yards of tarmac, Gate 7 was dissolving into controlled chaos. Serena Ashford's people had arrived at 6:45 p.m. for what should have been a straightforward 40-minute flight to Meridian City. The deal she was closing there, a merger that would either make Novatech the dominant player in aerospace logistics software or expose every crack in the company's foundation, was scheduled to be signed at 9 a.m. the following morning. Her legal team was already there. Her CFO had flown commercial 3 days earlier to prepare the room. Every piece of paper, every clause, every contingency had been reviewed, argued over, revised, and reviewed again. The only thing left was for Serena to show up. Her aircraft, a Gulfstream G500, tail number N7742SA, 3 years old, maintained on a rigorous schedule that cost more per month than Elias earned in a year, had been pre-flighted by her company's contracted aviation team at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Everything checked out. Systems green, fuel loaded, weather window identified, a 40-minute gap in the storm system, tight but workable, that opened around 8:15 p.m. At 7:22 p.m., when the ground crew ran the final power-up sequence before boarding, the aircraft didn't respond correctly. The avionics flickered. The autopilot system threw an error code that the crew chief, a veteran named Dennis Ruiz, had never seen in 17 years of Gulfstream work. He ran the diagnostic twice, then a third time. The error didn't clear, it multiplied. By 7:35 p.m., 3 different warning systems were active simultaneously, and the aircraft's fly-by-wire control system, the computerized network that translated pilot inputs into physical control surface movements, was returning inconsistent readings that made the plane, in Dennis's professional assessment, unflyable. He walked across the wet tarmac to the terminal building where Serena was waiting and told her directly, because Dennis Ruiz had been doing this long enough to know that softening bad news only made it worse. "Ms. Ashford, the aircraft is grounded. I can't put you in the air tonight." Serena looked at him for a long moment. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, her dark hair pulled back, a leather portfolio tucked under her left arm. She was 30 years old. People in the industry had been writing about her since she was 26, when she took over Novatech after her predecessor's abrupt resignation and turned what everyone expected to be an orderly decline into something that looked, depending on who you asked, either like a miracle or an extremely well-executed gamble. Forbes had called her the most dangerous person in aerospace tech. She found that description both flattering and slightly exhausting. Right now, she looked at Dennis Ruiz and said, "How long to fix it?" "That's the problem," he said. "I don't know what I'm fixing yet." Her VP of operations, a compact, fast-talking man named Gregory Holt, appeared at her elbow with his phone already out. "I'm pulling charter options. There's a citation available out of Westfield. It's 40 minutes away, but—" "Weather window closes at 9, Serena said. She wasn't asking. She already knew. "Yes. So that doesn't work. Commercial out of Terminal C. There's a red-eye through Chicago that connects to— I'd land at 8:57. The signing is at 9. "I know." "Gregory." "I know, Serena." She walked to the window. Outside, the rain had intensified again, drumming against the glass in waves. The runway lights were barely visible. She pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose, a habit she'd had since college, the physical gesture of forcing herself to think instead of react, and stared at the Gulf Stream sitting 60 yards away, dark and silent on the tarmac. Behind her, the noise level in the room escalated. Her communications director was already on a call, managing what she was calling contingency optics, which was her way of saying she was figuring out how to spin a missed meeting to the press. 2 members of the legal team had materialized from somewhere and were arguing in urgent whispers about force majeure clauses. Dennis Ruiz was back on his radio, trying to reach an avionics specialist who was apparently driving in from 30 miles out. Nobody was looking at the window, which is why Serena was the only one who noticed the figure outside. He was moving along the fence line near Gate 7, his work light swinging low, his coveralls dark with rain. He wasn't running. He wasn't hurrying with the frantic energy of someone responding to an emergency. He was just walking, steadily, purposefully, toward her aircraft. He stopped at the nose, crouched down, ran his light along the underside, then stood and moved to the left engine nacelle. Something about the way he moved made Serena watch him longer than she intended. He wasn't one of Dennis's crew. She'd seen all of Dennis's crew. This man was different, thicker through the shoulders, moving with a kind of deliberate economy that came from years of repetitive physical work. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't aware anyone was watching him. He was just looking at her plane the way you look at something when you're trying to understand it rather than impress someone. She turned to Gregory. "Who is that?" Gregory squinted through the rain-streaked glass. I'm not sure." "Find out." "Well," Elias had finished the hydraulic inspection on the Cessna at 7:40 p.m. and was walking back toward the maintenance hangar when he passed Gate 7 and noticed the Gulf Stream sitting alone with its running lights off. That was unusual. A G500 with its lights off in active gate space, storm rolling through, no ground crew visible. That combination snagged something in his brain the way a loose thread snags a fingernail. He stopped. He knew he shouldn't. He had a report to file on the Cessna. He had a 40-minute drive home in this weather. Maya's babysitter, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Okonkwo, who lived 2 doors down, had already texted him twice, and he'd promised to be back by 9. He stopped anyway. He walked to the aircraft and began to look at it. He didn't know whose it was. He didn't know about the meeting in Meridian City, or the merger, or the 9 o'clock signing. He didn't know anything about Serena Ashford, except that he vaguely recalled seeing her name on something in the news once, maybe 6 months ago, something about a company acquisition. He had no context for the situation he was walking into. What he had was 17 years of looking at aircraft. He'd started as a line service technician at 18, washing planes and pumping fuel for $7 an hour. He'd worked his way through his airframe and power plant certification while working full-time, studying at night, missing sleep in quantities that probably would have alarmed a doctor. He'd been hired at Hargrove 8 years ago and had worked on everything from single-engine trainers to large-cabin jets. He was not the most credentialed person in his field. He was not the fastest or the most aggressive or the best at selling his own capabilities, but he noticed things. His wife Claire had said that about him once, said it in the warm, slightly teasing way she had of identifying his qualities without making them sound like traits from a performance review. "You notice things, Eli. Like, you actually see them." She'd been talking about the way he noticed that their neighbor's mail had been piling up for 4 days before anyone else thought to check, but the same quality applied to aircraft. He noticed things, and standing at the left engine nacelle of the Gulfstream in the rain, running his work light slowly along the lower cowling, he noticed something that tightened his stomach. The cowling fasteners, the Zoo's fasteners that held the engine access panel in place, were seated wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that would jump out at a quick visual. Wrong in the specific, subtle way that happened when someone had opened that panel and closed it again without properly torquing each fastener to spec. 3 of the 8 fasteners were a quarter turn short. One was slightly cross-threaded. That could have been maintenance error. It happened. Nobody was perfect. Except the maintenance log affixed to the gate post, a waterproof clipboard in a clear plastic sleeve, showed the last scheduled maintenance access on this aircraft had been 11 days ago. The pre-flight inspection that afternoon, signed off by Dennis Ruiz's crew at 4:07 p.m., hadn't flagged the cowling, which meant those fasteners had been touched between 4:07 p.m. and right now. Elias stood in the rain for a moment, thinking about what that meant. Then he asked the gate agent, a young man sheltering in the gate doorway, if he could get access to the maintenance supervisor on duty. The gate agent looked at him, looked at his badge, looked at the aircraft, and went to make a call. 2 minutes later, Dennis Ruiz was standing next to him in the rain. Elias showed him the fasteners without saying anything. He just pointed. Dennis crouched down with his own light and looked for a long moment. "That's not from my crew," Dennis said. "I know," Elias said. They looked at each other. "I need to go inside," Elias said. Serena was mid-conversation with Gregory when the terminal door opened and Dennis Ruiz came in, followed by a man she'd never seen before. The man was soaked through, his coveralls dripping on the tile floor, his work light still in his hand. He had rainwater running down the side of his face, and he didn't bother wiping it off. He looked around the room once, quickly, taking inventory, then found Serena and walked toward her with the directness of someone who didn't waste time on ambient social anxiety. "Ms. Ashford," Dennis said behind him, "this is Elias Carter. He's a Level 3 tech with the Airport Maintenance Division. He flagged something on your aircraft." Serena looked at Elias. "What did you find?" "Engine cowling fasteners on the left side were disturbed after your afternoon pre-flight," Elias said. "I need to look inside before I say anything else, but I can tell you right now that someone opened that panel after your crew cleared it." The room got quieter. Not silent. The communications director was still on her phone in the corner, but the conversation density dropped noticeably. Gregory stepped forward. "That could be a maintenance error from—" "No," Dennis said. "It's not. My crew's logs are clean and I know my guys." Serena kept her eyes on Elias. "You're saying someone tampered with my aircraft?" "I'm saying someone opened an access panel that should have stayed closed. What they did inside is what I need to figure out." "How long?" He thought about it honestly. Not the optimistic timeline, not the answer designed to make her feel better. "If it's what I think it might be, a couple hours minimum. Could be more. I need to be in Meridian City by 9 tomorrow morning." "I understand that. Can you fix it?" "I don't know yet what's broken." He paused. "I'm going to be straight with you. If this is what I think it is, this isn't a maintenance issue. This is a deliberate act. Which means before I touch anything else, you probably want someone documenting what we find." The room got quieter still. Serena stared at him for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds. "Gregory," she said quietly, "get our security director on the phone, and get the airport authority." She looked back at Elias. "Do what you need to do." Yes, sir. What Elias found over the next 90 minutes, working methodically through the aircraft with Dennis Ruiz and a second technician named Paul Yeager, who'd driven in from his house still wearing a sweatshirt with a college logo on it, what they found was not what any of them had expected, and all of them had suspected something bad. The avionics errors that Dennis couldn't explain were not random failures. They were the output of a specific interference, a small device, no larger than a deck of cards, that had been attached to the back of the avionics bay firewall using a magnetic mount. The device was not sophisticated in the way that implied state-sponsored sabotage or science fiction. It was sophisticated in the way that implied someone who understood aircraft systems well enough to know exactly which component to target and exactly how to create error outputs that would look, to the diagnostic systems, like a cascading mechanical failure rather than external interference. The avionics error codes that had stumped Dennis for 17 years of Gulfstream experience were designed to stump him. They were designed to look like a chain reaction originating from a sensor failure in the environmental control system. A believable, complicated failure that would require a parts order and a minimum of 48 hours to properly diagnose and repair. That would have put the Meridian City meeting well out of reach, and if somehow the interference had been missed and the aircraft had attempted to fly, Elias's voice was careful and level when he explained this to the airport authority investigator, because this was the part where his stomach went cold. The fly-by-wire inconsistencies would have produced unpredictable control responses during the approach phase of flight. The investigator, a woman named Teresa Mack, who had been doing this job for 22 years, wrote very quickly in her notebook for a long moment after Elias finished that sentence. "Unpredictable how?" she said. "In a way that would be attributed to pilot error," Elias said. "After the fact." Teresa Mack stopped writing. She looked at him over the top of her glasses. "You're confident in this assessment?" "I'm not confident about anything yet," Elias said, "but I'm confident enough that I'm saying it out loud." She looked at him for another moment, then flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. Serena was sitting alone at a table in the corner of the terminal when Elias came back inside. Alone was relative. Gregory was 12 feet away on his phone. Her communications director was working through her third cup of coffee nearby, and 2 airport security officers were stationed near the door. But no one was immediately next to her, and she had her leather portfolio open on the table in front of her, though she hadn't written anything in it for over an hour. Elias sat down across from her without being invited. He did it simply, without aggression or self-consciousness, the way someone sits down when they have something to say, and the formalities feel like a waste of available time. "Your aircraft is going to be impounded for investigation," he said. "That's official now. Teresa Mack, she's the authority investigator. She's already made the call." "I know," Gregory had told her 10 minutes ago. "The device, what was it exactly?" "A signal interference unit, custom built. Whoever made it knew what they were doing." He folded his hands on the table. They were still dirty from the work, she noticed. Oil under his fingernails, grease along his knuckles. He hadn't bothered cleaning up. It was designed to survive the pre-flight inspection and activate during the power-up sequence. Your crew didn't miss it. They couldn't have found it with standard pre-flight protocols. "But you found it." He was quiet for a second. "I found the cowling fasteners first. That's what pointed me in the right direction." "Why were you looking at my aircraft? That's not your assigned area." He glanced away briefly. Not evasively, but thoughtfully, the way someone looks away when they're deciding how much explanation is actually necessary. "I was walking past. The lights were off and the positioning didn't look right. That's all." "That's all," she repeated. "I notice things," he said. I don't know. I've always been that way." Serena looked at him. He was not what she was used to. Most people, when they were in a room with her, oriented toward her in a specific way, presenting themselves, trying to manage her impression of them, constructing a version of themselves for her to see. It was subtle most of the time, and she'd learned years ago not to hold it against people because it was just human nature amplified by professional stakes. But Elias Carter sat across from her and seemed to be simply present, the same person he was when she'd watched him through the rain-streaked window, moving along the underside of her aircraft in the dark without an audience. "Someone planned this carefully," she said. "Yes." They had access to this aircraft. They had technical knowledge. They had time between the pre-flight clearance and the boarding call. She paused. "That's a short window. About 3 hours." "About 3 hours," he agreed. "And they had to know your flight schedule, the specific departure time, the weather window." He looked at her steadily. This wasn't opportunistic. She already knew that, had known it since he first walked into the terminal. But hearing it said plainly by someone who had no stake in softening it landed differently than knowing it in the abstract. "Someone inside my organization," she said. He didn't answer because it wasn't his place to answer, and he seemed to understand that. He just held her gaze. She looked down at the leather portfolio. She'd been trying, while she sat alone, to think through the last several weeks. What she'd noticed, what she'd dismissed, what she'd chalked up to the ordinary background noise of running a company at the level she was running Novatech. Missing files. An anonymous note that security had investigated and closed as a disgruntled ex-employee. 3 resignation letters in a 6-week period from people who'd given her HR department different explanations. She'd been busy. There were always things to dismiss when you were busy. "My security director is flying in from New York," she said finally, "and my legal team is already in Meridian City. I need to She stopped. She rubbed her eyes once, which was not something she normally did in front of people. "I need to figure out how to run a crisis investigation and still close this deal." Elias looked at her without judgment. "Is the deal closable tomorrow?" "Not if I'm not there." "What do you need to be there?" She almost laughed. Not happily. More like the laugh that surfaces when a situation is too absurd to process straight. "An aircraft, which I don't have. A time machine would also work." "The storm window reopens at 6 a.m., he said. "I checked the radar an hour ago. 6 to 7:15. That's a real window, not tight. If there's an available charter—" "Gregory is on that," she said. "He's been on it." Elias nodded. He seemed to consider whether to say anything else, then, "You should sleep, even a few hours." She looked at him. "I know that sounds like something my mother would say. Like something that's true," he said simply. "You've got 6 hours. You can spend all of them on the phone, or you can spend 3 of them on the phone and 3 of them asleep, and you'll do the other thing better for it." He paused. I'm not trying to tell you how to—" "No, you're right." She said it without softening it, because she didn't soften things when they were true. "You're right." He nodded once and pushed back from the table. "The investigator is going to want to talk to you again in the morning," he said. "She's going to find what I found, and more. Teresa Mack is good at her job." "And you?" Serena said. "What are you going to do?" He looked mildly surprised by the question. "Go home," he said. "My daughter's waiting." So, he drove home in the rain with the heater on high and the radio off. It was 10:47 by the time he pulled into the driveway of the small house on Clement Street, a 2-bedroom place he rented month to month because owning felt like a conversation he'd have later, when later arrived. The porch light was on. Mrs. Okonkwo's car was still in the spot she used, the old Buick with the dented rear quarter panel and the parking sticker from the community college where she'd taught 3rd grade for 31 years. He sat in the car for a moment before going in. He was tired in the deep structural way that didn't respond to coffee. The kind of tired that had been accumulating for 4.5 years now, since Claire died, since everything reorganized around that fact, and he'd had to figure out how to be 2 people in one body. Every day required a version of himself that was capable, steady, uncomplaining, reliable, at work, at home, in the school parking lot, in the pediatrician's waiting room. The performance of competence was exhausting, not because he wasn't competent, but because competence required maintenance too, and nobody asked how you were doing when you were the person who was holding things together. He went inside. Mrs. Okonkwo was asleep in the armchair with the television on low, a true crime documentary murmuring in the background. She woke when she heard the door, the practiced alertness of someone who'd spent decades responsive to children. "She's been asleep since 8:30, Mrs. Okonkwo said, not unkindly. "She had a piece of toast and some soup. I told her you'd check on her when you got home." "Thank you, Dorothy," he said. I know. Go." She was already gathering her things. After she left, the house was quiet, in the particular way that houses were quiet when the person most likely to make noise was asleep. Elias hung up his keys. The hook by the door had a little star on it, painted there by Maya with red nail polish, because she'd decided the hooks needed to be more interesting, and walked down the short hallway to her room. She was 7 years old, and she slept like someone who had made a firm decision about sleep and refused to revisit it. Completely committed, arms out, the stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald tucked under her chin. She looked like Claire when she slept. It still hit him sometimes, quietly and without warning, the specific punch of that resemblance, the particular angle of her jaw, the way her dark eyelashes fanned out against her cheek. He stood in the doorway for a minute, just stood there, in the way that parents do when they don't have any particular reason to stand there, except that the specific quality of their child's presence is the only thing in the world that doesn't require any management. Then he went and heated up the rest of Mrs. Okonkwo's soup, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, filed his maintenance report on his laptop, and fell asleep in his work clothes on the couch. By morning, Teresa Mack had confirmed everything Elias found and several things he hadn't. The interference device had been installed with professional precision, but the magnetic mount had left microscopic alignment marks on the firewall that gave forensic technicians a timeline. The device had been placed between 5:30 and 6 p.m. the previous evening, approximately 90 minutes after the pre-flight clearance and about 90 minutes before the boarding call. Security footage from Gate 7's external camera had been deleted. Not failed. Not corrupted. Deleted. By someone who knew the recording system's architecture well enough to remove a specific 90-minute window without affecting the footage on either side of it. That took knowledge. Not the kind of knowledge you found in a manual. The operational knowledge of someone who had been inside the system, specifically this airport's specific security infrastructure, and had spent time learning it. Serena's security director, Marcus Webb, who had been doing corporate security for 2 decades and had the unhurried confidence of someone who had seen most categories of crisis, arrived from New York at 7 a.m. and went directly to the Airport Authority investigation room. By 8 a.m., he was on the phone with Serena, his voice carrying the controlled flatness of a man delivering information he didn't enjoy delivering. 3 names, he said. Serena was in the small office the airport had given her for the night, her blazer draped over the chair, her phone on speaker on the desk in front of her. She had slept for 3 hours, exactly as prescribed. Tell me, people with access to the security deletion protocols, the specific architecture that was used, there are 3 employees at Novatech who have that level of system knowledge. IT administrative staff, senior level. One of them also has documented familiarity with the Hargrove Airport network, because he managed the vendor relationship 2 years ago when Novatech was evaluating a logistics partnership here. Name. I want to be careful. Marcus. Victor Crane, he said, VP of Strategic Operations. The room was quiet. Victor Crane had been at Novatech for 9 years. He had been, at various points, the person most likely to be named Serena's successor when the previous CEO stepped down. Instead, the board had chosen Serena. Victor had stayed. He'd been gracious about it, or had performed graciousness so consistently for 3 years that the performance had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He'd been in her leadership team meetings every week. He'd been in her corner publicly, reliably, in every external forum. He had also, Marcus told her, submitted a proposal to the board 6 weeks ago, privately bypassing the CEO's office entirely, which was a violation of corporate governance so blatant it should have triggered an automatic flag, outlining a restructuring plan that was premised on the current CEO's inability to close the Meridian City deal. The proposal had been dated 4 weeks before the meeting was even publicly announced. He knew about the Meridian timeline before the press release, Serena said. He knew before your own communications team knew, Marcus said. He has access to the internal planning calendar through his operational role. He would have known the exact flight schedule, the weather constraints, the signing window. Serena sat with that for a moment. She thought about Victor in their weekly leadership meeting 2 Tuesdays ago, asking careful, solicitous questions about the Meridian preparation. She thought about the way he'd offered, casually, to take things off her plate during the lead-up to the trip. She thought about the missing files 3 weeks ago, documents related to the Meridian term sheet that had vanished from the shared server and been recovered from a backup 2 days later, which IT had logged as a sync error. She thought about how she'd accepted that explanation because Victor had seemed as puzzled as everyone else. She picked up her blazer off the chair. Where is he now? New York, as far as we know. Get legal on the phone and get me a car. She paused. And find out how that maintenance technician is reached. Elias Carter. I want his supervisor to know what he did last night. Already? Marcus said. Already, she said. Hudson. The charter flight left at 6:20 a.m. in a sky that had cleared to something pale and washed and almost apologetic, the way skies looked after heavy weather, stripped of humidity and left with a particular clarity that made everything at ground level seem slightly unreal. Serena was in the air by 6:23. She landed in Meridian City at 7:04. She walked into the signing room at 8:51. Her legal counterpart, a senior partner named Andrew Collum, who had been doing M&A law for 30 years and had the emotional range of a well-maintained filing cabinet, looked up from the conference table when she walked in and said, "You look like you've had an interesting night." "Not the word I'd use," she said, and sat down. Back at Hargrove, Elias was on his second coffee and his third work order of the morning when his supervisor, a large and generally phlegmatic man named Gary Hutchins, appeared at the door of the maintenance bay and said, "You know the Novatech CEO?" Elias looked up from the fuel system schematic he was reviewing. "I met her last night, briefly." Gary had a specific expression that he deployed when something was happening that was outside his normal operational bandwidth. A kind of controlled bewilderment, like a man who has found an unusual animal in his yard and is deciding whether to be concerned or merely curious. He was wearing that expression now. "Her security director called the airport director this morning," Gary said, "and the airport director called me." Elias waited. "There's going to be a federal investigation," Gary said. "You're apparently—" "The investigator listed you as a key witness and significant contributor to the discovery of the tampering." He paused. "There might also be a letter from the CEO. A letter of appreciation or recognition. They used both words. I wrote them down." Gary looked at his notepad. "Also, there's a reporter from the Tribune who has somehow—" "No," Elias said. Gary looked up from his notepad. "I don't want to talk to a reporter," Elias said. "Tell them I have nothing to say." Gary looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something. "You found sabotage on a CEO's aircraft that could have killed people. That's a significant thing, Elias." "I know what it is," Elias said. "I just did my job." That wasn't entirely true and wasn't entirely false, and Gary seemed to understand that because he didn't push it. He put his notepad away, told Elias there would be some paperwork, and left. Elias finished his coffee, picked up the fuel system schematic, and went back to work. At 3:15 that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Serena Ashford. The deal closed at 11 a.m. I'd like to speak with you when you have time. S.A." He stared at it for a moment, then he typed back, "Glad it worked out. Busy until 5. There was a pause, then 5 works. He put his phone back in his pocket and finished the inspection he was on. He had 45 minutes before he needed to pick up Maya from school, and he'd promised her they'd make pancakes for dinner because she'd been asking for 2 weeks, and he kept pushing it back. And tonight, he was not pushing it back. Whatever Serena Ashford wanted to say could happen in the 40 minutes between 5 o'clock and the school pickup. After that, he was a different kind of busy entirely. The kind that nobody outside of that small house on Clement Street had any claim on. He tightened the last bolt on the inspection panel, initialed the work order, and clipped it to the aircraft. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in days. He made the pancakes. That part mattered more than most people would understand. Not the deal in Meridian City, not the federal investigation that Theresa Mack had formally opened by noon, not the text sitting in his phone from one of the most scrutinized young executives in the country. The pancakes mattered because he'd promised Maya 2 weeks ago, and he'd pushed it back 3 times already, and 7-year-olds kept track of things like that with a precision that shamed most accounting software. She was waiting at the school gate when he pulled up at 3:40, her backpack hanging off one shoulder the way she always wore it, slightly lopsided, which had nothing to do with the weight distribution and everything to do with the fact that she thought it looked cooler that way. She climbed into the back seat, buckled herself in with the particular efficiency of a child who had been doing it long enough to consider it beneath comment, and said, "Are we actually doing pancakes tonight?" "We're actually doing pancakes tonight," Elias said. She considered this with the gravity it deserved. With the blueberries or without? Your call. With, she said immediately, as if there had never been any other option, and she was slightly concerned he'd forgotten the parameters of their arrangement. Then she pulled out a library book about deep-sea fish and read for the entire drive home, which was another thing she'd gotten from Claire. The ability to be completely, unapologetically absorbed in something to the exclusion of all surrounding context. Elias drove and didn't think about the aircraft. He thought about eggs and whether they had enough baking powder and whether Maya's school shoes were going to last another month before the soles started separating again like the last pair had, slowly and then suddenly. The way things deteriorated when you were monitoring 12 different things at once and gave each of them about 80% attention. The phone call with Serena happened in his car, parked in the driveway, at 5:03, while Maya was inside already pulling the mixing bowl out of the cabinet with the mechanical confidence of someone who had been promised pancakes and was not waiting on adult initiative to begin. "I'll make it short," Serena said. She sounded different from the previous night, not more relaxed exactly, but more settled inside herself, the stripped-down quality you got from a person who'd been through something and come out the other side still standing. "The deal is done. Victor Crane was removed from the building at 2:15. Marcus Webb is working with federal investigators." A pause. "I wanted to call personally, not through an assistant, not a letter, through HR." "Okay," Elias said. "That's it? Just okay?" "I don't know what else you want me to say." She made a sound that might have been half a laugh. "Most people would say something like you're welcome, or maybe ask what this means for them. Does it mean something for me?" "I'd like it to," she said. "That's actually what I'm calling about. But I don't want to have that conversation in a parking lot. Would you be willing to meet? In person. Not at the airport." Another pause, shorter. "I'm aware that's an odd request from someone you met 14 hours ago." Elias looked at the front window of the house. The kitchen light was on. He could see Maya's shadow moving around, and he'd bet money she was already cracking eggs without waiting for him, which was fine, except she'd been dropping them on the counter more often than in the bowl lately and hadn't yet developed the self-awareness to admit this was a recurring issue. "I have to go make dinner," he said. "I can meet Saturday, somewhere neutral." "Saturday works." She didn't negotiate the venue or the timeline or ask for his schedule. She just accepted it, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected more executive energy, the subtle pressure toward her convenience, her timetable. "There's a coffee place on Haverford Street, Clements. Do you know it?" "I know it." 10 o'clock? 10 works. He went inside and found that Maya had in fact cracked 3 eggs directly onto the counter, one of which had rolled to the edge and was making a decision about whether to commit. He caught it. "I was about to get that," she said. "I know you were," he said, and handed her the mixing bowl. They made the pancakes. Maya narrated the process with the authority of someone who considered herself the executive chef and her father a useful but subordinate kitchen presence. The blueberries went in unevenly, which she maintained was intentional distribution strategy. The first batch came out slightly darker than intended because she'd turned the heat up without telling him, and she assessed them critically, decided they were rustic, and ate 4 of them. Elias ate 2, standing at the counter, and thought that the evening was fine. Just fine, in the plain and sufficient way that fine actually was, when you let it be that instead of measuring it against everything it wasn't. He put Maya to bed at 8:30, read 2 chapters of the deep-sea fish book with her because she'd made a compelling case that it was educational and therefore didn't count against the reading before bedtime limit, and then sat on the couch in the quiet house and let himself think about Victor Crane. Not about the investigation, not about the legal mechanics of what happened next. Marcus Webb and Teresa Mack and the federal apparatus could work through all of that without his input. He thought about the man himself, in the abstract. Someone who had spent 9 years inside a company, building relationships, accumulating trust, attending meetings and sending emails and shaking hands at industry events, and who had, somewhere in those 9 years, decided that all of it was instrumental rather than actual, that the relationships were leverage and the trust was a resource to be spent and the organization itself was a mechanism for serving his specific ambition. Elias had met people like that. Not many, and none with Victor Crane's resources or position. But the quality itself wasn't rare. He'd worked alongside a guy at a previous job years ago who had that same quality of treating every interaction as a transaction and every piece of information as potential currency. The man had been very good at seeming warm. He was the type who remembered your kids' names and asked about them in a way that felt personal until you realized he kept notes, and the warmth was a delivery system for the notes rather than a feeling he actually had. The thing that was hard to sit with wasn't that those people existed. It was that they were usually caught late, after things had already broken, after someone had already paid a cost that couldn't be refunded. In this case, the aircraft hadn't flown. The damage that was meant to happen hadn't happened. The outcome of the immediate crisis was, by any reasonable measure, a good one. But Elias knew how close the margin had been. He knew it not in the abstract, measured way of after-the-fact reporting, but in the specific physical way of having stood at that cowling in the rain, in the dark, for no reason except that something had snagged in his brain like a loose thread. If he'd been 10 minutes further along on his walk back to the hangar, if the Cessna inspection had run short instead of long, if he'd been the kind of person who looked at things that weren't his assignment and kept walking, he didn't sit with that possibility long because sitting with it had a ceiling. There was only so much you could do with the awareness of near misses before it stopped being useful and started being something else entirely. He'd learned that lesson in a different context, in the months after Claire died, when he'd spent considerable time reconstructing the specific chain of events that had led to the morning of the accident and identifying every point where a different decision would have produced a different outcome. That exercise had a logic to it. It also had a cost, and eventually he'd had to put it down, not because the logic was wrong, but because the cost was one he couldn't keep paying. He turned off the living room light and went to bed. The federal investigation moved faster than most people expected federal investigations to move, which Theresa Mack would later attribute to the fact that the evidence was unusually clean, not in the sense of being free of complication, but in the sense of being comprehensively documented before anyone had a chance to obscure it. The interference device itself was a significant piece of physical evidence. The deleted security footage was traceable through metadata that the deletion had not erased, and Victor Crane, it turned out, had made several communication errors in the preceding weeks that suggested a level of confidence bordering on carelessness. Emails sent through channels he believed were protected that were not, a financial transaction associated with the custom device that an investigator with 3 hours and a subpoena could trace without much difficulty. Marcus Webb described it later in a conversation with Serena's legal team as the work of someone who was very smart in a narrow band and assumed that band was wider than it was. Victor Crane understood aircraft systems and corporate governance and organizational psychology. He understood how to read a room and how to position himself and how to make a move look inevitable in retrospect. What he apparently hadn't accounted for was the possibility that a maintenance technician walking back to a hangar in a rainstorm would notice that 3 cowling fasteners were a quarter turn short. The smallest things, Marcus said, and left the observation there. Serena was in New York when she got the update on the evidence inventory, sitting in the corner office on the 38th floor that she'd occupied for 3 years, and still, on certain mornings, walked into with a slight sense of displacement, as if some part of her was perpetually expecting someone else to be sitting at the desk. She read Marcus's report straight through, then read the investigator's preliminary findings, then set both documents down and looked out the window at the midtown skyline for a long moment. Her assistant knocked and came in with coffee, set it on the desk, and left without being asked to. That was Emma, who had been doing this job for 2 years and had developed a specific sensitivity to the quality of Serena's silences. This was the kind that did not want company. Serena picked up the coffee and thought about Victor Crane for the second time that day. She'd been doing that with some regularity since Marcus named him, not with the heated emotional charge that might have been expected, but with the cooler, more uncomfortable feeling of retrospective examination. Going back through interactions and meetings and hallway conversations and trying to separate what she'd actually seen from what she'd assumed, because the assumption was easier. People tended to take information and fit it to the existing narrative, and her existing narrative for Victor had been difficult but manageable, ambitious but contained. She'd been monitoring him the way you monitored a weather system that had declared itself and could therefore be tracked. She hadn't been monitoring what she couldn't see. That was the part she had to sit with. Not that Victor had done this. Once she knew what he'd done, the how and why resolved into a coherent picture without much effort. The part she had to sit with was the gap between what she thought she knew about her own organization and what had apparently been true inside it. She was good at her job. She had worked very hard to be good at her job. She had taken a company that most industry observers had written off at 33 and turned it into something significant. She had not done that by being unobservant or naive. And yet a man in her own leadership team had spent months executing a plan to destroy her career and her company's future, and she had not seen it. Not until a maintenance technician with a work light and a habit of noticing things had found 3 fasteners in the dark. She drank her coffee and let that be uncomfortable, because it was, and because pretending it wasn't would mean learning the wrong lesson. Saturday morning came in gray and mild, the kind of late autumn weather that hadn't committed to being cold yet, but wasn't pretending to be warm either. Elias dropped Maya at her weekend art class, a 2-hour session at the community center that she'd been attending for a month, returning each time with progressively more paint on her arms and progressively stronger opinions about color theory, and drove to Haverford Street with 20 minutes to spare. Clements was a small place, independently owned, the kind of coffee shop that had survived the chain proliferation by being specific. Specific beans, specific roasts, specific neighborhood, specific clientele of people who had opinions about extraction ratios, and were generally polite about it. He'd been coming here since Maya was 3, because it was 2 blocks from the park they used to walk to on weekend mornings, back when walking to the park had been a family thing rather than a 2-person thing. He ordered a drip coffee, found a table near the back window, and was working through the maintenance journal he'd brought, a running log he kept on paper, old school, because he'd found over the years that writing findings by hand made him retain them differently than typing. When Serena Ashford walked in, she was wearing jeans and a dark green sweater, her hair down. Without the blazer and the leather portfolio and the ambient emergency of a grounded aircraft and a derailing business deal, she looked younger. Not less formidable exactly, but more like a person and less like a position. She spotted him, got a coffee from the counter, and came to the table with the directness that he'd already come to associate with her. No meandering approach, no social warm-up orbit. She sat down and looked at him and said, "You look like you slept." "I did," he said. "You look like you didn't." "I slept fine." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I just don't look good when I haven't been in the office for a week." "You've been in the office." "I've been in 4 offices. That's different." He closed the maintenance journal and set it to one side. "How is the investigation going?" "Moving. Marcus says the federal team is confident in the evidence. Victor's attorney has already started making noise about cooperation, which means the attorney thinks the evidence is solid too." She said it flatly, without satisfaction. "He'll cut a deal. That's how this goes." "How do you feel about that?" She looked at him with a brief expression that might have been surprised, not offense, but the particular alert quality of someone who wasn't asked that question very often in professional contexts. "Honestly? Preferably. Frustrated. Because a deal means it's over faster, which is what the company needs. And what the company needs generally takes priority over what I feel about it." She paused. "And also I'm angry. I'm not losing sleep over it. But there's a version of this where his plan worked, where I'm on a grounded aircraft in a storm, and nobody finds what he put in my plane, and I miss the signing, and the board gets his restructuring memo, and the narrative becomes that I couldn't close the most important deal of my tenure." She set her cup down. He had been building that narrative for months. It was very carefully built. The memo to the board, the file disappearances, the resignations he engineered. 2 of those 3 resignations were people who were starting to ask questions he didn't want asked. He paid them to leave, essentially. Through channels I haven't fully untangled yet. Elias thought about what he'd said to her in the terminal 2 nights ago, someone inside your organization, and the careful way he'd held his expression while she processed that. "You couldn't have seen all of it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I should have seen more." She said it without self-pity, which was the quality of self-assessment he respected, the kind that looked at a thing directly and called it what it was without collapsing into it. "I've been thinking about that. About the difference between not having full information and not looking hard enough at the information I had. Most people don't separate those. Most people find it more comfortable not to, she said. I can't afford comfortable. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a small dog that appeared to be wearing a coat, which the dog seemed to regard as an ongoing injustice. I want to offer you something, Serena said, and I want to be clear that this isn't a transaction. I'm not trying to buy your silence or manage you into a position where you feel you owe me a particular response. I want to be straight with you because you were straight with me, and I think that's the only currency that makes sense in this situation. Elias looked at her. Go ahead. Novatech's aviation safety division is being restructured, she said. It should have been restructured 2 years ago. What happened with my aircraft? Even if it had never happened, the protocols that allowed someone to access a cleared aircraft during a 3-hour window without triggering a flag were inadequate. I have a division of people who are adequate at compliance and not especially innovative about prevention. She met his eyes. I'd like you to lead it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Not as a consultant, she said, as the director. Full team authority. Compensation that reflects the position, not what you're currently making. She said a number. He kept his expression level, which took some effort because the number was real. Not symbolic, not a gesture, but an actual significant change. You'd relocate to New York. The position would require it. I know you have a daughter, and I know that's not a minor consideration, so I want you to have time to think about it rather than answering me right now. I appreciate that, he said. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why me specifically? He said it without false modesty. He wasn't deflecting or fishing for reassurance. He genuinely wanted to understand the reasoning. You have access to every credentialed aviation safety professional in the country. People with more degrees than I have, more management experience, more industry connections. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because all of those people would have walked past your aircraft, she said. Not because they're not good at what they do, but because they're trained to look at what they're assigned to look at. You looked at something that wasn't your assignment, in bad weather, at the end of a shift, because something didn't fit. And then you said what you found without hedging it, or softening it, or calculating what I wanted to hear. She picked up her coffee. I have plenty of people who are good at what they're assigned. I need someone who looks at what's actually there. It was a logical argument. It was also, he suspected, not the only argument. There was something in how she'd said it that suggested she was being comprehensive rather than fully transparent. But he didn't push it. He had time to understand the full shape of a decision before he made it. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. She didn't press. She didn't follow the offer with a sell, didn't enumerate the benefits, didn't lean forward with the sales energy of someone who needed him to say yes in this particular room at this particular moment. She just picked up her coffee and seemed content to sit with him in an ordinary coffee shop on a Saturday morning like a person rather than a negotiator. That, he thought, was either very sophisticated or very genuine. He wasn't sure yet which one. They talked for another half hour. Not about the offer. It sat between them, present but not pressing. They talked about aviation, about the specific challenges of maintaining safety culture inside organizations that treated safety as a compliance function rather than a values question. She knew more about it than he expected. She asked good questions, the kind that revealed genuine prior thought rather than performed curiosity, and she disagreed with him twice. Once about inspection protocol standardization, once about the relative value of experience versus credential in technical hiring decisions, in the direct, non-combative way of someone comfortable with being wrong and comfortable with being right in equal measure. At 9:45, she looked at her phone. I have a call at 10:15. I need to get back. I need to pick up my daughter at 10:30. They both stood. She pulled on her coat, dark wool, slightly worn at the right cuff, in a way that suggested she'd owned it long enough to mean it, and picked up her bag. One more thing, she said. Not about the offer. Separate from it. She seemed to be choosing her words with more care than usual, the deliberate quality of someone who wanted to say something precisely and knew that imprecision would undermine it. What you did the other night, I know you've said it was just your job, and I know you mean that, But I want you to know that I understand the gap between what your job required and what you actually did. Those aren't the same thing, and not everyone would have done it. Elias nodded. Not dismissively, he was listening. I know that the way the world works, the quiet people who do the important things often don't get told that their thing was important, she said. And I know one conversation for me doesn't change the structural reality of that, but I wanted to say it plainly anyway. She paused. What you did mattered, not just to me and not just to the deal, to the people who fly on aircraft that are now going to be subject to a federal investigation of tampering protocols, to a company that could have been hollowed out from the inside by someone who had everything to gain from its failure. She looked at him directly. It mattered. He held her gaze for a moment. He didn't deflect it or rush past it. Okay, he said. Thank you. She nodded once. It seemed like she'd expected exactly that response and was satisfied with it. Outside, they went in separate directions. Elias walked back to his car through the mild gray morning, and he thought about New York. Not about whether he wanted it yet, because he wasn't ready to put the question that squarely, but about what New York meant in the abstract. A different city. A different school for Maya. A different routine, built from nothing, in a place where neither of them knew any faces. Mrs. Okonkwo and her Buick with the dented quarter panel, 2 doors down. The park they walked to on weekend mornings. The kitchen with Maya's handprints and old paint on the cabinet above the stove, put there when she was 4, and he hadn't been able to make himself paint over them. He sat in the car for a minute before starting it. He was 32 years old. He had 17 years of looking at aircraft, and 4.5 years of doing it alone, and a daughter who called his dinosaur lanyard clip the best part of Dad's boring badge. He had a life that was not glamorous and not easy and was, by most external measures, modest. And he had built it carefully and with intention out of materials that weren't always cooperative, and he didn't think it was small. He thought it was actual. New York was not an idea he'd had about himself. But he'd also, until 3 nights ago, not had any particular idea that a single quarter turn of a cowling fastener would do anything except get logged in a maintenance report. He started the car. At the community center, Maya came out carrying a painting she held at arm's length in both hands, which was the appropriate transport method for something that might or might not have dried yet. The painting appeared to be a large orange creature of uncertain species on a bright blue background. She regarded it with the mixed critical satisfaction of an artist who knows what they intended and is currently evaluating the execution. What is it? Elias asked. It's Gerald, she said. My art teacher said it was expressive. I think she meant she couldn't tell what it was. I can tell it's Gerald, Elias said, which was a lie, but a loving one. She considered this. I think the proportions are wrong. The proportions are fine. His legs are too small. Gerald doesn't care about his legs. She looked at the painting one more time and seemed to arrive at a working peace with it. Can we put it on the fridge? Absolutely, he said. She handed it to him, climbed into the back seat, and pulled out the deep-sea fish book. Elias held the painting for a moment, the orange creature with its 2 small legs and its bright blue world, and then laid it carefully on the passenger seat. He drove home the way he always drove home, through the familiar streets, past the corner with the hardware store that had changed ownership twice but kept the same orange awning, past the school with its empty weekend parking lot, past the fire station where the garage doors were open and someone was washing one of the trucks with the slow, methodical attention of a person who took care of the things they were responsible for. He turned onto Clement Street. What happened next was not his decision yet. It would take him 8 more days to make it. 8 days of thinking and not thinking, of watching Maya in her routines and imagining them differently, of running numbers that worked and running feelings that were harder to quantify. He would call Serena once during those 8 days to ask 2 specific questions about the position's operational scope that he'd been turning over and that she answered without spin, which confirmed something he'd been assessing without formally assessing it. But on that Saturday, he pulled into the driveway of the house on Clement Street and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet. He didn't know yet what he was going to do. He knew the pancakes had been good, that Maya thought Gerald's legs were wrong, that the federal investigation was going to turn over something significant inside a company he'd walked through exactly once in his life. He knew that Teresa Mack was good at her job And Marcus Webb was methodical, and Victor Crane's attorney was already making the sounds that attorneys made when the wall was visible, and climbing it wasn't an option. He knew he was tired and that the tiredness was not the bad kind. It was the kind that came from having done something real, which was different from the accumulated weight he carried most days. The tiredness of maintenance and management and keeping the whole operational structure of a small life from developing the slow leaks that eventually grounded things for good. He got out of the car. Maya was already at the front door with her key, unlocking it with the focused determination she brought to all fine motor tasks that required patience she was still developing. "Dad?" she said, pushing the door open. "Can Gerald go on the fridge even if his legs are wrong?" "Gerald goes on the fridge regardless of his legs," Elias said. She went inside, satisfied. He picked up the painting from the passenger seat, tucked it under his arm, and followed her in. The 8 days passed the way uncertain days do. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a texture that was different from ordinary time, each morning carrying the low-level awareness of an unresolved thing sitting somewhere in his peripheral vision that he wasn't looking at directly yet. He went to work. He filed reports. He inspected a Beechcraft Baron with a landing gear irregularity that turned out to be a worn actuator bushing, caught it before it became something worse, wrote it up, moved on. He made Maya's lunch every morning. Peanut butter and honey, crusts removed, because she'd decided crusts were unnecessary about 2 years ago, and he'd stopped arguing the nutritional case since it wasn't a hill he was willing to die on. He helped her with a school project about ecosystems that required the construction of a shoebox diorama representing a coral reef, which involved 3 trips to the craft store and a surprising amount of disagreement about whether the plastic fish were the right scale relative to the cardboard coral. He called Serena on day 5. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He asked about the division's current headcount and whether he'd have authority over hiring decisions, or whether those went through a centralized HR process that reported to someone above him. She told him the headcount was 14 people, that hiring authority for his direct reports would sit with him subject to standard HR process, and that the one person he'd need to manage upward to was her. He asked one follow-up question about budget autonomy. She answered it. He thanked her and said he'd have a decision by the weekend. He didn't tell anyone he was considering it. Not Gary Hutchins, not Mrs. Okonkwo, not the guys in the maintenance bay who had been treating him with a slightly different quality of attention since the story about the Gulf Stream had moved through the airport with the particular velocity of professional gossip in a small community workplace. Paul Yeager had clapped him on the shoulder one morning and said, "You're going to be famous, man," in a tone that was half admiring and half unsure how to calibrate this new information about the guy he'd worked next to for 6 years. Elias had said, "I really hope not," and meant it, and Paul had seemed to find that both endearing and baffling. He didn't tell Maya. She was 7, and 7-year-olds were not equipped to hold the provisional weight of an undecided thing. You told them what was happening after you knew what was happening. He'd learned that lesson in the months after Claire died, when he'd made the mistake of saying, "We might have to move," to a 4-year-old who then spent 3 weeks in a state of low-grade anxiety about moving that manifested as difficulty sleeping and a brief but intense refusal to eat anything green. He'd learned to protect her from the uncertainty of things that hadn't resolved yet. On the 8th day, he drove to the cemetery. He didn't go often, not because it felt wrong or because he'd put distance between himself and Claire's memory. She was present in his daily life in dozens of small ways that had nothing to do with the geographic location. But sometimes he went when he needed to think through something out loud, and the house felt too full of her, too layered with the specific domestic texture of a life they'd been building together, to think about it in isolation. The cemetery was quieter in a different way, more neutral. He stood at her headstone for a few minutes. He didn't talk, because that had never been his style. He wasn't a man who felt the need to narrate his internal state into the middle distance. He just stood there in the gray November air with his hands in his jacket pockets, thinking about New York and Maya and the question of what a different life looked like and whether he had the right to want one when the life he had was already a thing he'd built with intention. Claire would have had something to say about it. She would have had several things to say about it, delivered in her direct way, starting with the question he was avoiding and ending with some variation of "you're overthinking the part that doesn't matter" and underthinking the part that does. She'd been good at identifying which was which, a skill he'd always been slightly in awe of because his own process was thorough to the point of sometimes circling back on itself. What he knew, standing in the cemetery on a gray Wednesday morning on his day off, was this: the life on Clement Street was real, and it was his, and it was built from grief and work and the specific daily love of raising a daughter who had opinions about color theory and fish proportions. He didn't want to blow it up for an abstraction. But he also knew, and this was the part he'd been circling, that keeping everything exactly as it was, because it was familiar, was not the same as choosing it. And he didn't want to live in a life that he'd ended up in rather than chosen. He drove home and called Serena and said yes. The conversation was brief. She said good. He said he needed 60 days to organize the transition, Maya's school semester. Sabotaged. Okonkwo's notice, his notice to Gary, finding a place to live in New York that was within a school district he'd researched, and that didn't cost more per month than he currently made. She said 60 days was fine. She said HR would be in touch before end of week. She did not say, "I'm glad," or "you won't regret this," or any of the things that people said when they wanted to close a decision with a ribbon on it. She just said good and meant it and let it be what it was. He told Maya that night. She was at the kitchen table doing homework, multiplication tables, which she approached with the resigned efficiency of someone completing a necessary but unpleasant administrative task, and he sat down across from her and waited for her to finish the row she was on. She looked up. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you say anything, okay?" She studied him with the particular alert quality children developed when they sensed that adult tone, the deliberate one, the one that meant the next sentence mattered. "Okay," she said carefully. He told her, New York, new job, new school. He told her the parts that were good, and he told her the parts that were going to be hard, and he didn't oversell either of them. He told her they'd have to leave the house and find a new one. He told her they'd have to leave Mrs. Okonkwo. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He watched her processing it, the specific internal machinery of a 7-year-old working through information that was too big to fit through all the channels at once. "What about Gerald?" she said finally. He took a second to understand she meant the stuffed rabbit. "Gerald comes." "Obviously," she said, with a tone that suggested the question had been a test of his basic competence, and he'd just barely passed it. Another pause. "Will there be art class in New York?" "There's art everywhere in New York," he said. "More than here." She absorbed that. "Will I have to make new friends?" "You will?" "That's hard," she said. "I know. But I did it when we moved to the new classroom at school." "You did." She looked at her multiplication tables for a moment, then back at him. "Is it a good job, Dad?" "I think it is, yeah." "Do you want to do it?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without putting more weight on the answer than a 7-year-old should carry. "I think it's important work," he said, "and I think I can do it in a way that helps people." She seemed to find this acceptable. She was quiet for another moment, then picked up her pencil and went back to the multiplication tables. He waited to see if there was more. Without looking up, "I want a room with a window." "I'll find you a room with a window," he said. "A big one." "I'll do my best on the size." She wrote down 7 times 8 without counting on her fingers, which was new and which he noted with the quiet, accumulating satisfaction of parental observation. Then she looked up again. "Can I tell Mrs. Okonkwo?" "We'll tell her together," he said. "Tomorrow." She nodded, apparently satisfied with the terms, and went back to her homework. Elias sat at the table for another minute without moving, watching his daughter work through her multiplication tables in the kitchen, where the light above the stove needed a new bulb and Maya's handprints were still on the cabinet in old paint. And he felt the particular mixture of things that came with a decision made. Not relief exactly, and not certainty, but a kind of settling, the way a structure settled after a long vibration finally stopped. He got up and started making dinner. The 60 days were full and grinding and occasionally absurd. Gary Hutchins took the news with the controlled bewilderment he applied to most things outside his operational bandwidth, stared at Elias for approximately 4 seconds, and then said, "Well, okay," which was Gary's way of expressing a range of complex feeling. The maintenance crew had a more expressive response. Paul Yeager organized what he called a low-key thing at a bar 2 blocks from the airport that turned out to be about 30 people and not especially low-key. And Elias drank 2 beers, deflected approximately 40 versions of the question, "So what's the CEO actually like?" and was home by 10:15. He found the apartment in the Inwood neighborhood at the northern end of Manhattan, a 3-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building with an elevator that worked most of the time. A super named Ray, who seemed to interpret all maintenance requests as personal affronts, but fix things within 48 hours regardless. And a school 6 blocks away that Maya's new teacher, a woman named Ms. Park, who wore large earrings and had a classroom wall covered in student artwork, had agreed to meet with him before the semester start. Mrs. Aden, Okonkwo cried when they told her, which was the only time Elias came close to reconsidering, because watching a 71-year-old woman cry in her kitchen over the news that the family 2 doors down was leaving was a specific kind of hard that no amount of logical preparation accounted for. Maya cried too, which made Mrs. Okonkwo cry harder, and Elias held both of them in the kitchen for a while and said things that were inadequate but the best available option given the circumstances. Mrs. Okonkwo made them promise to come back for summers. Maya made her promise to water the plant on the porch that she'd been informally responsible for 2 years. They both kept their promises with the gravity of a treaty. The last thing Elias packed on the last morning was the work light from the garage. He'd almost left it. It was a work tool, technically the kind of thing that transferred with the job rather than the person. But it was his. He'd bought it himself 8 years ago, replaced the battery pack twice, used it in every inspection he'd done since. He wrapped it in a sweatshirt and put it in the box with the rest of the things that were his in the specific way of having been used enough to belong to him. They were in New York by February. The first month was difficult in the way that first months in new places were difficult. Not dramatically, not with a single identifiable crisis, but with the accumulated friction of unfamiliar systems. Maya came home from her second week at the new school quiet, in a way that wasn't her ordinary reading-absorbed quiet, but the compressed processing quiet of a child who'd had a day that was heavier than she wanted to admit. Elias didn't push it. He made dinner. At some point during the meal, she said, "There's a girl named Priya in my class who knows everything about deep-sea fish," with the tone of someone reporting an unexpected plot development, and he understood that a connection had been made somewhere in the day that she hadn't figured out how to feel about yet. 2 weeks later, Priya came over for a Saturday afternoon that extended until Priya's mother came to collect her at 6:30, and both girls looked up from the floor where they'd been constructing. What appeared to be an elaborate habitat for Gerald, made from cardboard boxes and purple construction paper, with the expressions of people who had significantly underestimated how fast time was passing. New York, Maya reported to Mrs. Okonkwo on a video call, had a lot going on. At Novatech's aviation division, Elias walked into a situation that was exactly what Serena had described, and also more complicated than the description had fully conveyed, which was true of most situations you inherited from the outside. The 14-person team was competent in the specific, narrow way of people who had been doing the same well-defined job for long enough to be good at the defined version and somewhat rigid about the undefined version. Their safety protocols were compliance-driven, built to satisfy regulatory requirements, documented with precision, reviewed on schedule. What they weren't built for was the kind of lateral thinking that Elias had been doing, without a name for it, for 17 years. The gap between a protocol that covered what was expected and a process that caught what wasn't expected was the gap he was there to close. He spent the first 3 weeks not changing anything. He watched. He attended every meeting, read every report, sat in on 3 aircraft inspections without commenting, and ate lunch in the common area with different people on different days in the deliberately unstructured way of someone who was learning the social architecture of a team rather than installing himself at the top of it. He had learned, not from a management seminar, but from the specific experience of being the quiet person in a room full of loud ones, that people told you more when they didn't feel like they were being assessed. What he learned was that the team was smart and undertrusted. Several of the more experienced technicians had flagged procedural concerns in the past 2 years that had been absorbed into a reporting process and gone nowhere. Not because anyone had actively suppressed them, but because the structure routed concerns upward through a chain that treated them as compliance data rather than operational intelligence. The concerns were logged, acknowledged, and tabled in a sequence that felt responsive and was functionally inert. That was the first thing he changed, not with a policy memo. He started a weekly meeting, informal, no slides, an hour on Thursday mornings, where the team brought things they'd noticed that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. He called it the Anomaly Hour, which was a name that Paul Yeager would have made a joke about, and which the Novatech team received with the slightly reserved openness of people waiting to see if the thing meant what it said. It took 3 weeks for someone to bring something real. Her name was Diane Chu. She was 44, a 15-year aviation safety veteran who had joined Novatech 4 years ago and who had the careful, measured way of speaking that people developed when they'd been in environments where being wrong was more costly than staying quiet. In the third Thursday meeting, she brought a pattern she'd been tracking for 8 months in the maintenance logs of the charter fleet, a recurring hydraulic pressure anomaly that appeared in the logs of 4 different aircraft, always following the same maintenance cycle, always within a predictable window, always attributed on the log to normal operational variation. It's small, she said, in the way people said things they'd been sitting on for a while and had prepared the disclaimer for. The individual instances are all within tolerance. But the pattern isn't, Elias said. She looked at him. The pattern isn't random, she said carefully. I can't say more than that without more data. What data do you need? She told him. He got it for her. What Diane found over the following 3 weeks was not sabotage. It was something in some ways more insidious, because it was systemic rather than deliberate. A component supplier had been providing hydraulic actuator seals that met specification at the time of installation, but degraded at a rate faster than the spec predicted under certain temperature cycling conditions common to the flight profiles Novatech's fleet operated. The seals weren't defective in the legal sense. They were defective in the operational sense, the difference between what the paperwork said and what the reality did, which was a gap that only showed up in the pattern of a long-term maintenance log, and only if someone was looking for it. Elias brought it to Serena. He did it directly, walked into her office on a Tuesday afternoon because her assistant Emma had told him Serena kept an open-door policy for her division directors that she actually honored rather than performing, which turned out to be true. He laid out Diane's analysis on her desk with the same lack of ceremony he'd used in the storm-soaked terminal 3 months ago, because he didn't have a different mode for delivering information he considered important. Serena read through it. She asked 4 questions, all of them specific, all of them good. Then she looked up. How many aircraft are affected? Potentially the entire charter fleet, 19 aircraft. We've only confirmed the pattern in 4, but the maintenance cycle and temperature exposure are the same across the fleet. Timeline for full inspection? 6 weeks if we pull aircraft from rotation in sequence. 3 weeks if we ground the fleet. She was quiet for a moment. Grounding the fleet costs us $8 million in charter commitments. Not grounding the fleet and having a hydraulic failure costs us more than that, he said, in every sense. She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the specific quality of attention she gave to things she was evaluating without already having concluded. You're right, she said. I know you're right. I just need 30 seconds to be a person who doesn't want to lose $8 million before I make the right decision. He waited 30 seconds. Ground the fleet, she said, and get me the supplier documentation. Legal needs to know about this before it's anywhere else. He nodded and picked up Diane's report from her desk. Elias? She said, before he reached the door. He turned. The woman who found this, Diane Chu. Yes. Make sure she knows it mattered. He looked at Serena for a moment. Already planned on it, he said. The fleet grounding made noise. It always did. The charter clients were unhappy, 2 of them loudly, one of them through their legal team in a way that cost Novatech's attorneys a week of billing hours before it resolved. The press picked up a version of the story that was about 60% accurate and 100% negative in framing. The board had questions. Gregory Holt, who had survived the post-Victor organizational review and retained his VP role, which Serena had decided was correct and which Elias had no strong feeling about either way, managed the external communications with his usual compressed energy efficiency. But the fleet inspection found what Diane's pattern had predicted. 17 of 19 aircraft showed seal degradation beyond recommended operational limits. 3 of those 17 showed degradation severe enough that another 60 to 90 days of routine operation would have produced, with high probability, hydraulic pressure events during flight. The component supplier, confronted with the documentation, settled before a formal legal action was filed. Nobody crashed. Nobody died. The $8 million in grounded charter commitments was recovered, with penalties from the supplier settlement. Diane Chu got a promotion and a raise that Elias had put into his first formal HR request, and which Serena approved without modification. In the Thursday anomaly hour the week after the settlement closed, Diane came in with 2 more patterns she'd been sitting on, and this time she didn't lead with the disclaimer. That was the difference. Not in the system. The system was still imperfect, and would always be imperfect, because every system was built by imperfect people operating on incomplete information and subject to the constant drift of the real world away from the designed world. The difference was that the people inside the system were no longer performing at the edge of their actual capability in order to stay within the margins of what was expected. They were working at the actual edge, which was further out and more uncertain and produced. Occasionally, the kind of discovery that didn't show up anywhere in the protocol, because the protocol had been built from past failures rather than imagined future ones. Elias understood that distinction in his bones. He'd been operating at that edge his entire working life without knowing what to call it. He just hadn't been in a place where the edge was something to be cultivated rather than merely tolerated. He called Gary Hutchins once, about 6 weeks after the fleet grounding resolved. Not for any operational reason, just because Gary had been his supervisor for 8 years, and he'd left without any meaningful conversation about that fact. And Elias had been thinking about it in the background, and it felt like unfinished business. Gary answered on the second ring, which meant he was at his desk, which was where Gary always was during work hours, because Gary had the focused domestic habits of a man who had found a location that worked for him and saw no compelling reason to explore alternatives. "Carter," Gary said. Not a question. He had caller ID and he used it. "Hey, Gary. You calling to tell me how it's going in New York?" "Partly," Elias said. "Partly just calling." A pause. "It's going well, I assume, because you wouldn't call if it wasn't." That was an accurate read of him, and he acknowledged it. "It's going well." "Good." Gary cleared his throat. "Paul misses you. He's told me about 4 times. I keep telling him that's not information I need to have." Elias smiled. "Tell him I said hello." "I'll think about it." A beat. "You doing okay?" For real, not the work version. He thought about the apartment on the 4th floor with the frequently aspirational elevator, and Maya at school with Priya, and the Thursday meetings where Diane Chu was starting to walk in differently than she'd walked out 2 months ago. He thought about the work light sitting in his desk drawer at the office because he'd brought it from Hargrove and hadn't found a reason to leave it at home yet. "Yeah," he said. "For real, I'm okay." "Good," Gary said again, with the specific compression of a man who considered that an adequate and complete response to most things. "Don't screw it up." "I'll do my best." He hung up and went back to the hydraulic specification document he'd been reviewing before he called. And the afternoon went the way afternoons went now, full of specific, concrete work that he was not always certain he was doing right, and that he kept doing anyway, because the uncertainty was part of it, and the part of it that mattered was showing up regardless. That evening, he picked up Maya from the after-school program at 5:15. She came out with Priya, the 2 of them mid-conversation about something involving a disagreement with a third party whose offenses Elias gathered had been both numerous and recently enumerated. They said goodbye at the school gate with the elaborate seriousness of children partying after a war council. Walking the 6 blocks home, Maya told him about her day in the sideways, non-linear manner she had when she was processing rather than reporting. Fragments, tangents, a story about someone named Marcus who had apparently claimed that sharks were not fish, which she had felt the need to address factually and at length. "Was Marcus wrong?" Elias asked. "Marcus was 100% wrong," she said. "Did you tell him that?" "I showed him 3 pages," she said. which answered the question more completely than intended. He held her hand at the crosswalk. The city around them was doing what the city did at 5:30 on a Tuesday, running at speed, indifferent to any particular life within it, the specific beautiful indifference of a place too big to make you special and too layered to leave you alone. He'd been learning to like it in the way you learn to like anything complex, by finding the parts of it that were yours. The elevator worked that evening. Maya reported this as if it were a meaningful development, which it was. She did homework while he made dinner. He overcooked the pasta by about 2 minutes, which Maya identified immediately and rated as still fine, the 7-year-old equivalent of a mixed review. He ate it anyway, standing at the counter the way he always ate when dinner was also a decompression from the day, looking out the kitchen window at the building across the way where a man on the 3rd floor was watching something on a very large television and a woman on the 5th floor was doing what appeared to be yoga with a dedication that suggested she'd been going for a while. The ordinary ongoing life of other people, visible through windows at evening, which was one of the specific textures of this city that he'd started to find not lonely but companionable. The reminder that existence was happening everywhere, in all its unresolved and imperfect variety, without requiring him to participate in it or explain himself to it. He washed the dishes and dried them and put them away. Maya brought him a drawing she'd done of Gerald, this version with intentionally correct-sized legs, which she considered a significant artistic revision. He put it on the refrigerator next to the original from the community center, which had made the trip from Clement Street rolled in a paper towel and had been the first thing to go on the new refrigerator when they arrived. "Both versions," he said. "The new one is better," she said. "The old one has character." She considered this. "Okay," she said, meaning I'm going to allow this position even though I don't fully agree, which was, he thought, a reasonable way to navigate a difference of opinion. He put her to bed at 8:45 and sat on the couch in the quiet apartment, which was not the same quiet as the house on Clement Street. It had the particular urban undertone of the city working its overnight shift, the distant sirens and the ventilation hum and the occasional muffled sound of the neighbors above, who seemed to be involved in a furniture arrangement project with no apparent endpoint. Different quiet. His now, in the way that things became yours through occupation and time and the accumulated specificity of your own life inside them. He picked up the maintenance journal, the same handwritten one he'd been keeping for 3 years, about 60 pages in, and added 3 notes from the day. A question about the hydraulic spec he wanted to follow up on. A thought about the anomaly hour format that might make it more useful. A note to himself to ask Diane whether she documented her methodology in a way that could be replicated if she ever left, which was the kind of thing people forgot to build into a process while the process was working and remembered after. He closed the journal and set it on the end table next to the couch, under the lamp that Maya had decided needed a different shade, and which they had not yet replaced because the shade replacement project had stalled at the point where it required actually going to a store rather than discussing it. He sat for a while in the lamplit room with its boxes that were 80% unpacked, and its walls that still didn't have anything on them except the hooks by the door, which Maya had again marked with nail polish. Red stars, same as before, carried forward. And he was, not simply, but truly, in the way that required all the complexity and the difficulty and the loss and the work and the daily imperfect accumulation of a life being lived forward, okay? More than okay. He was, in the specific quiet of that particular evening, somewhere he had chosen to be. Spring came to New York the way it always did. Not all at once, but in negotiation. Warm days interrupted by cold ones. The city cycling through its wardrobe indecisively before finally committing sometime in mid-April. The trees in the park 6 blocks from the apartment put out leaves in the tentative way of things that had been burned before and were taking their time about it. Elias had been at Novatech for 4 months. He knew the number because Maya had made a paper chain on the first day. 1 link per day, she'd announced, until they'd been in New York for a whole year. And the chain now stretched from her bedroom doorknob to approximately the middle of her wall, which was further than either of them had expected it to reach by this point. She'd run out of red paper 3 weeks in and switched to whatever color was available, so the chain was a record of the craft supply situation at any given moment. Red, then blue, then a long stretch of yellow, currently purple. The apartment had developed the specific texture of a place inhabited rather than occupied. The walls still didn't have much on them, but the refrigerator was layered with Maya's drawings in 3 overlapping rows, and the hook by the door had acquired a second set of keys, a spare set, which Elias had made after the 3rd time he'd been 5 minutes from the building and couldn't remember if he'd locked the door. The lampshade replacement project had been completed. Finally, on a Saturday in March when Maya had decided the current shade was aesthetically unacceptable and had located an alternative at a second-hand shop 2 blocks away with the focused efficiency of a person who had simply been waiting for the right moment to act. At work, the Thursday anomaly hours had become something real enough to have developed a culture. People came with things they'd been sitting on. They argued sometimes, not badly, but genuinely, in the productive way that happened when people felt secure enough to disagree out loud. Diane Chu had taken on an unofficial role that didn't have a title yet, something between senior analyst and institutional memory, and Elias had been working through how to formalize it in a way that gave her the authority her actual function required without creating a layer of hierarchy that would slow the thing down. The work was good. That was the honest assessment, not without frustration. There were days when the gap between what he could see and what the system could currently process felt wide enough to fall into, but good in the way that mattered, which was that it had consequences. Real ones, for real aircraft, carrying real people who didn't know his name and never would. He was thinking about a fuel flow irregularity on a maintenance report from the morning when Serena knocked on the open door of his office. He looked up. She was in her standard working configuration: blazer, dark trousers, leather portfolio, the quality of focused energy that she seemed to generate as a matter of metabolic function. But there was something else in her expression, a slight compression around her eyes, that he'd come to recognize as the specific look she had when something was happening that she hadn't fully sorted yet. "Do you have 20 minutes?" she said. "Yes," he said, and closed the maintenance report. She came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk, the chair that was still slightly too low relative to the desk, an ergonomic mismatch that he'd been meaning to address and hadn't, and set the leather portfolio on her knee without opening it. "Victor Crane took a plea," she said. Elias had known this was coming. The federal timeline had been tracking toward it since February. When was it finalized? "This morning, 18 months, federal facility, mandatory restitution." She said it with the flat delivery of someone who had prepared the sentence carefully, not because the words were hard to say, but because the preparation was how she managed the distance between information and feeling. "Marcus called me at 7:30. How do you feel about it?" She looked at him with the brief flicker of recognition she sometimes showed when he asked her that question. She'd noted once, in an aside during a conversation about something else entirely, that most people in her position stopped getting asked how they felt about things because the people around them assumed they'd already resolved it or assumed the question wasn't appropriate at their level. He'd found that observation genuinely strange and had said so, and she'd seemed unsurprised that he found it strange, which told him something about both of them. "Relieved," she said. "And also, I don't know. Anticlimactic." She set the portfolio on the desk. "I spent 3 years working with that man, in the same rooms, the same table, and the ending is an administrative procedure. He signed something, I signed something through a proxy, numbers get transferred, and it's over." "Did you expect something different?" "I expected something that felt more like a conclusion," she said. "This feels like closing a browser tab." Elias thought about that. Maybe that's the right feeling. "How do you mean?" "Because he didn't deserve more of your mental real estate than a browser tab," he said. "He tried to make himself the center of a story that was yours. The fact that his ending doesn't feel significant might mean it isn't." She was quiet for a moment, looking at something slightly to the left of him. "That's either very wise or very convenient," she said. "Probably some of both." That got a sound from her that was close to a laugh. Not the performed kind, but the shorter, involuntary kind that surfaces when something lands without warning. She picked up the portfolio again, then set it back down. "I keep thinking about the people who left. The 2 he paid out. I've been trying to decide what I owe them." "Have you talked to them?" "One of them. She was willing. The other one isn't." A pause. "The one I talked to, Her name is Rena Vasquez. She was in our data security division. She was asking questions about some anomalies in the IT access logs 6 weeks before she resigned. Victor found out, had a meeting with her, and apparently told her that the company had concerns about her performance and was considering a formal review, then offered her a settlement to leave quietly. Serena's voice was level, but had a specific tension in it, the kind that came from containing something rather than expressing it. She was here for 6 years. She was good at her job. She left because a man who had his own reasons to suppress what she was finding used the institution as a weapon against her. What did you tell her? I told her I was sorry, that it wasn't adequate, but it was true. She looked at him. She asked if I'd known. I told her no. She said she believed me. Another pause. I'm not sure if she did. Elias didn't try to resolve that for her. It was the right kind of thing to leave unresolved. Not everything had a cleaner version, and offering one when it didn't exist was a form of insult dressed up as comfort. She's working somewhere else now, Serena said. She said she was happy there. I don't know if that was for my benefit. Probably both, Elias said. People are usually telling the truth and managing your reaction at the same time. Those aren't exclusive. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating quality she brought to things that surprised her slightly. You do that thing, she said. What thing? Where you say the exact true thing without making it feel like a verdict. He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't. She seemed to not require a response. There's something else, she said. That's actually why I came down. She opened the portfolio this time. The board wants to do something public about the investigation, the fleet grounding, the safety program. They want a press moment, controlled, organized, that repositions Novatech's safety record as a strength rather than a liability. Okay? They want you in it, she said. The story of how the sabotage was discovered. Your role in the fleet grounding. The anomaly program. She looked at him over the edge of the portfolio. I told them I'd ask you. He was quiet for a moment. I know your answer, she said before he could speak. I know it from the airport, when you told Gary you didn't want to talk to the Tribune reporter. I'm asking anyway because the board is asking, and because I think you deserve to make the choice rather than have it made for you. My answer is no, he said. I know. It's not modesty, he said. I'm not trying to be difficult. It's that the work is the thing. The press version isn't the work. And being in the press version would make the work harder because it would change how the people on my team related to me and how other people in the industry related to me in ways that would all be about something that isn't the actual job. She closed the portfolio. That's a more thorough answer than I expected. You asked. I did. She stood. I'll tell the board you prefer to stay operational. They'll be disappointed, and they'll get over it. She was at the door when he said, What will you tell the press? She turned. That the safety improvements came from a team-wide cultural shift, that the investigation was a catalyst, that Novatech's commitment to proactive safety identification saved the charter fleet from a systemic component failure. She paused. All of which is true. All of which is true, he agreed. She left. He went back to the fuel flow report and found, after another 20 minutes, that the irregularity was a sensor calibration issue rather than an actual flow problem, which was the aviation maintenance equivalent of a false alarm. Still worth the 20 minutes, because the alternative to checking was not checking, and not checking was how the small things became large things, while everyone was looking at something else. He logged the finding, closed the report, and went to the Thursday meeting. The season moved forward the way seasons did, without asking. May brought warmth that finally meant it. The park near the apartment became a different place, populated, in use, the specific urban reclamation of outdoor space that happened when the temperature crossed a threshold people had been waiting for. Elias started walking to work on the days when the weather was reasonable, which added 25 minutes each way, and which he found he needed in a way that was hard to articulate but had something to do with the transition between the part of him that was a father and the part of him that was a director, the walk being the buffer zone where he was neither and could just be a person moving through a city. Maya finished her school year in June with the Reef diorama, the New York version, rebuilt from scratch, even more elaborate than the Clement Street original, and featuring, at Ms. Park's suggestion, a written component that Maya had produced with an intensity that surprised even Elias. 4 pages about bioluminescent deep-sea organisms that Ms. Park had called frankly graduate level for a second grader, which Maya had received with the equanimity of someone who considered this a reasonable assessment. Priya came to the end-of-year celebration. Priya's mother, a pediatric nurse named Kavitha, who had the direct, warm efficiency of someone who dealt with small crises constantly and had developed a low threshold for pretense, came too, and she and Elias ended up standing together near the refreshment table talking about the neighborhood for 20 minutes in the easy, parenthetical way of adults who had been thrown together by their children and found the company unexpectedly comfortable. On the drive home, Maya said, "I think I like New York now." "Yeah?" Elias said. "I still think it's too loud sometimes," she said. "But Priya says you stop noticing after a while." "Priya's probably right." Maya considered this. "She's right about most things," she said, with the tone of someone making a factual observation rather than paying a compliment. "It's kind of annoying." "The best people usually are," he said. She thought about that for a block. "Is that why you like Ms. Ashford?" He glanced in the rearview mirror. "What do you mean?" "She came to my school thing today," Maya said, as if this were information he should already have and simply hadn't organized yet. "She talked to Ms. Park for a while, and then she talked to me." Elias processed this. "She was at the end-of-year celebration?" "She came for the last part," Maya said. "She said she had a meeting nearby." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the street. "She asked me about the diorama. I told her about the bioluminescent organisms. She said she didn't know fish could make their own light." A pause. "I told her most people don't. She said that was the interesting thing about most things. Most people don't know. She seemed kind of sad when she said it, but also like she liked it." Elias drove. "Is she your friend?" Maya asked. He thought about how to answer that honestly to a 7-year-old who would file whatever he said and refer to it later with the recall of a court reporter. "She's someone I work with," he said, "and I respect her. And I think I'm starting to understand her, which is different from knowing her." Maya received this. "Ms. Park says understanding someone takes a long time." "Ms. Park is right about most things too," he said. "I know," Maya said, and went back to the window. That evening, after Maya was in bed, Elias texted Serena. He didn't overthink the wording. He just typed, "Maya mentioned you came to the school thing. You didn't have to do that." The response came back in 4 minutes. "I know. I was in the neighborhood and I wanted to see what the reef diorama looked like. It was impressive." He typed, "She'll want to tell you about every organism in it individually if you give her the opportunity." "I know. She already started. I gave her my card." He stared at that for a moment. "You gave a 7-year-old your business card. She asked for it." A pause, then, "She said she might have follow-up questions about bioluminescence." He set the phone down and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific helpless amusement of a parent whose child has done something both completely in character and somehow still surprising. He picked the phone back up. "That tracks," he typed. "Thank you. For going." "She's good company," Serena wrote back. "She has very clear opinions. She gets that from her mother." He sent it before he'd fully decided to send it, which was not his usual style. It was the kind of thing that opened a door he hadn't been planning to open in a text conversation on a Thursday evening, and he sat with the slight discomfort of having done it. The response took longer this time. He didn't watch the phone. He got up and washed the dinner dishes and put them away and came back. "She'd have been proud of her," Serena had written. "That much is obvious." He read it twice. Then he set the phone down and didn't respond, because some things were complete in themselves and didn't need a response to be received. He sat in the lamplit room for a while. The thing about working alongside someone he'd been learning was that it built a specific kind of knowledge, not the biographical kind that came from exchanged histories, but the operational kind that came from watching how a person made decisions under pressure and what they prioritized when the priorities conflicted, and where the gap was between who they presented themselves as and who they actually were. He'd been building that knowledge about Serena for 4 months, in the same way she'd been building it about him, without either of them naming the process or making it into something it wasn't yet. What he knew, she was rigorous and she was fair and she was harder on herself than she was on anyone else, which was both a quality he respected and occasionally a problem because it produced a specific kind of tunnel vision, the kind that came from holding yourself to a standard no one else had set and being unable to see when the standard was costing you more than it was building. She worked too many hours, not out of performance, but out of genuine compulsion, the specific compulsion of someone for whom stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. She had the kind of humor that appeared unexpectedly and sideways, in the middle of serious conversations, which was his favorite kind because it meant it was real rather than deployed. She had come to his daughter's school thing. That wasn't nothing. He wasn't ready to decide what it was yet. He had learned in 4.5 years of doing everything alone to be patient with his own timing on things that mattered. Not because patience was comfortable, but because hurrying towards something because you were tired of the distance was different from moving toward it. Because the time was right, and he'd seen what happened when those two things got confused. But he wasn't going to pretend it was nothing either. The summer moved at the particular pace of a city in heat, which was faster and louder than the rest of the year, and simultaneously suspended in its own atmosphere. Maya went to a day camp that included, to her considerable satisfaction, a marine biology component. She came home every afternoon with new information about organisms she considered underappreciated by the general public. The paper chain reached the end of her wall and turned the corner. At work, Elias hired 2 new people for the division. A structural engineer named Tom Breck, who had spent 8 years doing failure analysis for an aerospace manufacturer and who approached problems with a methodical stubbornness that Elias found very useful, and a young technician named Sasha Kim, who was 26 and had come out of the Air Force with a systems thinking background, and the specific kind of hunger that came from knowing you were capable of more than your current context had allowed. He'd interviewed 7 candidates. He'd known with Tom in the first 40 minutes. With Sasha, it had taken longer. She was less polished in the interview, had answered 2 questions in ways that were technically incomplete, but had identified a flaw in a sample inspection scenario he'd included in the process that none of the other 6 candidates had caught. He hired her because of the flaw she caught and told her that directly, which seemed to throw her slightly. "Most people don't tell you why," she said. "I don't see the point of not telling you," he said. She'd looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality of someone recalibrating. "Okay," she said. "Thanks." She'd been good from the first week. Not perfect. She had a tendency to reach conclusions one step before the evidence fully supported them, which was the predictable overcorrection of someone who'd been trained in high-speed military decision environments and was still calibrating to a civilian context where the cost of a slightly slower conclusion was lower than the cost of a wrong one. He pointed it out directly and specifically in her second month, giving her a specific example from a recent inspection report rather than a general observation. She didn't like hearing it, which was visible on her face for about 3 seconds before she composed it. Then she said, "That's fair," and meant it, and the next report he saw from her had a notable change in how she documented her uncertainty intervals. That was the quality he was looking for. Not someone who didn't make errors. Everyone made errors, including him, including Diane, including Tom, who had 8 years more experience than anyone else in the room. The quality was what you did with the error once it was visible. He was thinking about that in the context of a different kind of question entirely, on an evening in late July when Serena knocked on his office door at 6:45, later than she usually came by. Late enough that most of the floor was quiet, Emma had left at 6. The ambient hum of the workday had faded to the specific silence of an office building after hours, which was somehow louder than regular silence. "You're still here," she said, which was an observation, not a criticism, because she was also still there. "Fuel cell documentation," he said. "The new regulatory framework drops in October, and I want to get ahead of it." "Good." She leaned against the doorframe. She'd taken off her blazer at some point during the day and hadn't put it back on, which was a small thing, but not a thing he was used to seeing. "I'm going to order dinner, the Thai place on 44th. Do you want anything?" He looked at her for a moment. "Are you asking if I want to stay and eat dinner here while we both finish working late?" "Yes," she said. "That's what I'm asking." "Okay," he said. "Pad seat U." "Spice level?" "Medium." She pulled out her phone and placed the order, still in the doorway. When she was done, she looked up and said, "Victor Crane's sentencing is in 3 weeks." "I know." "I'm not going," she said. "I thought about it. I decided I don't need to be there. It doesn't change anything." She said it like she was finishing a conversation she'd been having with herself. "I just wanted to tell someone that I decided." "Okay," he said. "I think that's right." "You didn't even think about it." "I've had the same conversation with myself about different things," he said. "The one where you decide you don't need to watch the ending because you already know what you feel about it. That's usually the right call." She looked at him from the doorframe with a quality of attention that was different from her work attention, more still, less directed toward a specific outcome. "4 months ago, you were fixing planes in a rainstorm," she said. "I was fixing one plane in a rainstorm," he said. "The others were fine." She smiled briefly and fully, the kind that didn't build up to itself. "Do you think about that night?" "Sometimes," he said. "Do you?" "More than I expected to," she said. "Not the sabotage part. The other part. You in that terminal, sitting down across from me, not asking what it meant for you." She paused. "I'd been surrounded all night by people calculating angles. You were the only one who wasn't." He didn't say anything. He let her finish the thought. "I think I built a company on the assumption that ambition was the thing that made people reliable," she said, "because ambitious people were predictable. They wanted something specific, and if you understood what they wanted, you could work with them." She looked down at the phone in her hand, then back at him. "I didn't have a good model for someone who did good work without needing it to be about themselves." "It's not that complicated," he said. "The work matters or it doesn't. If it does, that's enough." "For some people it is," she said. "For a lot of people it isn't. The needing recognition part gets attached to it pretty quickly." "I have my ways of needing things," he said. "I'm not especially selfless. I just don't need it from strangers." She seemed to find that accurate in a way that required a moment to settle. "No," she said, "I don't think you do." The food arrived 40 minutes later. They ate in the conference room down the hall, the long table reduced to one end of it, the city visible through the window in its evening configuration, lit up and going, indifferent and magnificent in the way that cities at height were magnificent, which was to say entirely without any awareness of being observed. The conversation was mostly about work, and partially about other things, in the natural proportion of people who had work in common and were finding out what else they had. She told him something about her first year running the company that she hadn't told publicly. A 6-week period where she'd been genuinely uncertain she could do it, where she'd gone home to her apartment and sat on the kitchen floor twice, just sat there, because the standing version of dealing with it had run out of capacity. He listened without offering the reassurance she wasn't asking for. He told her about the year after Claire died, not the full year, not the way it had felt to make dinner for 2 and remember halfway through and finish making it anyway because you'd committed to the motions and stopping was worse. Just a piece of it. Enough that she understood what 4.5 years alone actually meant, beyond the logistical version. She listened the same way he had, without rushing toward the end of it. It was after 9 when he left. He took the elevator down alone and walked out into the summer night, the city doing its late July thing, still warm, still moving, the streets not quiet but quieter than day. He walked half a block and stopped and bought a bottle of water from a cart, the way New York allowed you to buy a bottle of water at 9:15 at night on a street corner, as if this were a normal and expected human need, which it was. He thought about Maya, who was asleep at the apartment with the neighbor's daughter, a 14-year-old named Sophia who babysat on the evenings Elias ran late, at a rate that had been negotiated with the seriousness of a labor contract. He thought about the paper chain turning the corner of Maya's wall. He thought about Serena eating noodles in the conference room with her blazer off, telling him something she hadn't told publicly, in the easy, undefended manner of someone who had stopped calculating the angle. He started walking toward the subway. The night was warm and it was his, and he was in no hurry to resolve it into anything it wasn't yet. He had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the good things were worth approaching at the pace they required, and that the patience wasn't absence. It was a different kind of presence, the kind that left room for things to become what they actually were rather than what you needed them to be. He took the train home. He got in quietly. He checked that Maya was asleep. She was. Gerald tucked under her chin, the deep-sea fish book open on the nightstand to a page about anglerfish that had a photograph she'd shown him twice already, with the expression of someone who found the image both disturbing and deeply correct. He stood in the doorway for a minute in the way he always did, the way he suspected he'd always do, because it never got ordinary. Then he went to bed. August in New York had a particular quality that Elias had not experienced before moving there. A density to the heat, something almost physical about it, the way the city absorbed and retained warmth from the pavement and the buildings, and released it back at you from all directions simultaneously, so that walking a block felt like walking through something rather than through air. He'd grown up in a smaller city where summer was hot but had edges, where you could drive 20 minutes and find a field that had its own weather. Here the heat was totalizing. Maya found this fascinating rather than uncomfortable, which he attributed partly to her temperament and partly to the fact that she spent most afternoons in an air-conditioned camp building learning about cold water ecosystems, which created a useful psychological distance from the actual temperature outside. The paper chain had turned the corner of her wall and was heading toward the window. Victor Crane was sentenced on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of August. 18 months, as the plea had specified, plus 3 years supervised release and restitution in an amount that Novatech's legal team had negotiated and that Marcus Webb had described as meaningful but not satisfying, which was how restitution usually went. The federal judge had said something during sentencing about the nature of the crime, the deliberate targeting of a safety system, the willingness to engineer harm and attribute it to accident, that Teresa Mack, who had attended as the lead investigator, relayed to Elias in an email that evening. The judge had said that the most dangerous kind of dishonesty was the kind that wore the costume of plausible failure, that the system's ability to protect people depended on the integrity of the people inside it, and that when someone with technical knowledge chose to exploit that knowledge against the system's purpose, the violation was not merely criminal, but categorical. Elias read that twice. He thought Teresa Mack had sent it to him specifically because she understood that he would understand it specifically, and he appreciated that without needing to say so. Serena had not gone to the sentencing. She'd been in a board presentation all morning, which was not a coincidence. He understood that she'd arranged her schedule with intention, the meeting serving as both a genuine necessity and a structure that made the choice easier to live with. She'd texted him that afternoon. "It's done." He'd texted back, "I know, you okay?" She'd taken 20 minutes to respond, which meant she'd been in the board meeting, and when she did respond, it was simply, "Yes, working on it." That was the honest version of okay, and he respected it for being honest. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Not easier exactly, but less pressurized, as if something that had been pulling at the edges of everything had been removed, and the remaining structure could now find its natural shape. The investigation had been a background frequency in all of it since November, audible even when not attended to, and its resolution changed the ambient texture of the work and the organization in ways that were hard to specify, but were real. Diane Chu came to him in the 1st week of September with something that was not an anomaly. It was a proposal, a full document, 12 pages, outlining a methodology for building the anomaly identification process into a systematic cross-fleet analysis framework that could, if implemented, turn what was currently a team practice into something reproducible and scalable. She'd been working on it for 2 months. She set it on his desk with the careful manner of someone delivering something they'd put real effort into and weren't certain about the reception. He read it that afternoon. It was good. Not perfect. The section on data standardization across the fleet had assumptions in it that would create implementation problems she hadn't fully worked through. But fundamentally good, the kind of document that was good in the right direction, which was more important than being polished in the wrong one. He went to her office, which was 3 doors down and had a window she'd told him was the reason she'd taken the job when 2 other offers were on the table, and sat down across from her desk. "The data standardization section needs work," he said. "The rest of this is genuinely strong." She looked at him carefully. "Which part of the data standardization?" "The assumption that the maintenance logs from the charter fleet and the owned fleet use the same field architecture. They don't." The charter fleet records were migrated in 2021, and the migration left field mismatches in the hydraulic and fuel system categories that will break your analysis at the aggregation step. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that. I know. I found it during the SEAL investigation, and it's in a maintenance note from 2021 that isn't filed anywhere obvious. He paused. I'll send you the note. Fix that section, and this is ready to go to Serena. She looked at the document on her desk. You think she'll approve it? I think she'll approve it, fund it, and want it presented to the board as part of the safety program overview in Q4, he said. But that's her call. Diane nodded slowly, the nod of someone recalibrating upward. Can I ask you something? Yes. When you hired me, when you gave me the anomaly hour, did you know I had this in me, the methodology work? He thought about how to answer that honestly. I knew you had something you hadn't been given room to do, he said. I didn't know what it was. That's why I gave you the room. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, a kind of complex acknowledgement, as if she were filing the answer somewhere it would be referenced later. Okay, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. You did the work. The proposal went to Serena the following week. She read it overnight and came to Elias the next morning before he'd finished his first coffee, which was how he'd come to recognize that something had registered with her significantly. She processed fast, but she only acted fast on things that landed clearly. This is what I hired you to build, she said, standing in his doorway with her coffee and his copy of the proposal, which she'd annotated in the margins in blue pen with the focused energy of someone who didn't read documents so much as interrogate them. Not just the program, the culture that produced this document. Diane produced this document, he said, because you created the conditions for it. She set the annotated copy on his desk. Board presentation in October. I want you both there. Diane should present it, he said. It's her work. Serena looked at him with the brief evaluating expression. I agree. Will she be comfortable with that? She'll be nervous, he said. She'll do it well anyway. Good. Those are usually the right conditions for the best presentations. She picked up her coffee. One more thing. The board wants to talk about expanding the division. The Q4 presentation is going to include a budget ask for 4 additional positions and an extension of the anomaly framework to the third-party vendor relationships. She looked at him directly. That's a bigger division than you signed up to lead. Is that a question? It's information with an implicit question, she said, which I think you already know the answer to. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I just started. She nodded once and left, and he sat with his coffee and the annotated proposal and the specific satisfaction of a thing that was working as it was supposed to work. Not perfectly, not without friction, but in the right direction at a pace that was real rather than performed. He called Diane and told her she was presenting to the board in October. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough for him to wonder if the call had dropped. Then, the whole board? The whole board, he said. You'll be fine. You don't know that, she said. I know you found a SEAL degradation pattern across a fleet of 19 aircraft using 8 months of data and a spreadsheet, he said. The board is 12 people in a conference room. The confidence interval is in your favor. Another pause. That's actually a reassuring way to frame it. I know, he said. That's why I framed it that way. She laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her out of her own anxiety. He took that as the end of the conversation and let her go. September settled into its rhythms. Maya started second grade with Priya in the same class, which she had lobbied for with the strategic persistence of a person who understood that outcomes required advocacy. The reef diorama had been given a place of honor in Miss Park's classroom for the summer and was returned to Maya at the start of the new year with a note that said, "For the future marine biologist," or whatever she decides, which Maya read with the satisfied expression of someone receiving confirmation of a fact they already knew. The paper chain completed its journey across the window wall, and Elias bought more paper. Maya chose purple because she felt it had been underrepresented. On a Friday evening in the last week of September, he and Serena had dinner that was not about work. It had approached gradually and then arrived specifically, the way things did when two people were being careful with something they both understood was real. They'd been eating dinner at the office with some regularity through August, always framed as working late, always partly true, the work component genuine while also serving as the structure within which the other thing could happen without being named before either of them was ready to name it. The Friday dinner was different because he'd asked her, not in the office, not framed around a document or a late meeting. He'd texted her on a Wednesday. "There's a restaurant on Amsterdam Avenue I've been meaning to try. Friday, if you're free." She'd responded in 6 minutes, which he'd clocked without meaning to, with, "I'm free Friday." The restaurant was small and reliably good, in the unpretentious way of neighborhood places that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone and just cooked well. They talked for 3 hours. The conversation ranged in the way it did between people who had been thinking parallel things for a while and were finally in the same room without an agenda, about the company and not about the company, about Maya and about Serena's family in ways she didn't usually talk about in professional contexts, about what each of them had gotten wrong in the past 5 years and what they'd gotten less wrong than they'd expected. She told him she'd been in a relationship that ended 2 years ago, right after the first Forbes profile, in the specific way that things ended when one person's life had expanded beyond what the relationship had been built to contain. She said it without drama or excessive analysis. He told her about the year after Claire that he hadn't told anyone about fully, not the grief support version, but the practical version, the learning to be two people at once version, the version where he'd gotten it wrong regularly and kept going anyway because stopping wasn't available. She listened to that with the quality of attention she gave to things that mattered to her, which was different from her professional attention, less directed at implication, more just present with the thing itself. "You didn't have anyone helping you?" she said. "Mrs. Okonkwo," he said, "and Maya's pediatrician, who talked to me for 20 minutes after every appointment about things that weren't medical, and Gary Hutchins, who never once asked me how I was doing, but always managed to give me the shifts that ended at a time that worked for school pickup, without making it a thing." He paused. "People helped, just not in the ways that look like helping from the outside." She thought about that. "The invisible architecture," she said. "Something like that." "I've been learning to look for that," she said, "in the company, the informal systems that actually hold things together that nobody put in the org chart." She looked at her wine glass. Victor understood those systems. He just used that knowledge to erode them rather than protect them. "Some people do that," he said. "They understand how things work, and they decide the understanding is the asset rather than the thing the understanding is for." "Is that a category you think about?" "I think about what makes people decide the mechanism matters more than the purpose," he said. "I don't have a good answer. I've just noticed it's a decision point somewhere in there that most people don't notice they're making." She was quiet for a moment. "What's your decision point?" He thought about it honestly. "Maya," he said. "Probably. I can't. The abstractions stop mattering pretty fast when I'm going home to a person who is entirely concrete." He paused. "She asked me once why I fixed planes. She was 5. I said because if I don't do it carefully, people get hurt. She thought about it and said, oh, like how if you don't wash the fruit carefully, people get sick. I said yes, basically like that. And she said, so it's important even though it's not exciting. And I said yes." He looked across the table. "I've thought about that conversation a lot." Serena smiled, not the brief, involuntary kind, but the fuller, more sustained kind that meant it had reached somewhere. "She understood it before you finished explaining it." "She usually does," he said. "It's both gratifying and slightly unnerving." They walked back in the direction of his apartment after dinner because it was a September evening in New York, and September evenings in New York were the city at its most reasonable. Warm enough to be outside, cool enough to be comfortable, the streets carrying the specific energy of people who had survived the summer and were in a good mood about it. They walked slowly because neither of them was in a hurry, and that fact didn't require discussion. At the corner of his block, she stopped. "This is where I get a cab," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him in the particular way she looked at things she'd made a decision about. "I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to say it plainly because I'm not good at saying things indirectly, and I think you prefer it plain anyway." "I do," he said. "I'm interested in this," she said. in whatever this is. I'm interested in continuing it and finding out what it is. But I'm also aware that you have a daughter who is 7 and who has already lost one person. And I'm aware that my life is not simple, and I want to be the kind of person who accounts for those things rather than just pursuing what I want without looking at what it costs other people. She paused. So I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just telling you where I am, so you know. He looked at her in the September evening. I know where you are, he said. I've known for a while. He said it without calculation or performance. I'm in the same place. I just needed longer to get here because I needed to make sure I was going somewhere rather than leaving something. She held his gaze for a moment. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he said. She got in a cab. He walked the half-block home and found Sophia on the couch reading, and Maya asleep with Gerald in the anglerfish book, which had apparently been reassigned from informational text to bedtime reading. He paid Sophia, said goodnight, locked the door, and stood in the kitchen for a while with a glass of water, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once, in the way that the mind moved after evenings that had changed something without breaking anything. October came. Diane presented to the board. She was nervous, which was visible in the first 3 minutes, and then became invisible as the substance of what she'd built took over from the anxiety of presenting it. The board asked good questions, 3 of them very good, the kind that revealed genuine engagement rather than performed oversight. She answered all of them. The one she didn't know the answer to, she said she didn't know the answer to, and explained exactly what data would resolve it and how long that would take, which Elias had told her was the right move and which she had executed with more composure than she'd expected to have. The budget was approved. 4 new positions. Extension of the anomaly framework to vendor relationships. A formal name for the program. Elias had been asked to provide one and had submitted proactive safety identification program, which was functional and accurate and not the kind of name that invited branding, which was intentional. After the board meeting, in the hallway outside the conference room, Diane stood next to him for a moment with the look of someone who was still landing. That was, she started and stopped. Yeah, he said. I kept thinking about the anomaly hour, she said. The first one. I almost didn't bring the hydraulic pattern because I thought it was too small. I know, he said. I'm glad you brought it. She looked at the conference room door, then at him. What made you start the hour in the first place? Why that specifically? He thought about the terminal in the storm. The cowling fasteners that were a quarter turn short. The 17 years of looking at things, because looking at things was what you did when you were the person who did the looking. Because the most important things are usually the ones that don't fit the existing category, he said. And if you don't have a place for those, they disappear. She nodded slowly. The anomaly is the signal. Usually, he said. Not always, but often enough that you need a room for it. She seemed to file that in whatever internal architecture she used for things worth keeping. Okay, she said. Thank you, Elias. For real. He nodded. They both went back to work. The thing about a year, he thought sometimes, was that it had 2 kinds of length. There was the calendar length, 12 months, 52 weeks, the purple paper chain that Maya had now extended down the second wall toward the corner, and then there was the internal length, the accumulated weight of all the things that had happened inside the calendar, which was a different and considerably larger number. 1 year ago, he had been lying on his back under a Cessna in a rainstorm, working through an inspection that wasn't his assignment, with a dinosaur clip on his lanyard and a babysitter waiting and a 7-year-old's pancake request 3 times deferred. 1 year ago, the name Serena Ashford had meant something he'd seen once in a news headline and not retained. 1 year ago, New York was a city he drove past on the interstate occasionally, and Victor Crane was a name he'd never heard, and Diane Chu was a person he didn't know existed. He thought about all of that on a Saturday morning in November, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, while Maya and Priya ate cereal at the other end of the table and argued with cooperative intensity about whether the anglerfish or the barrel-eye fish was the more significant deep-sea organism. The argument had been ongoing for 3 weeks and showed no sign of resolution, which both of them seemed to find energizing rather than frustrating. Kavitha had dropped Priya off at 8:30 and stayed for coffee, which had become a thing that happened with some regularity now. She and Elias in the kitchen, while the girls did whatever they were doing, talking about the neighborhood, or the school, or the specific bureaucratic experiences of parenting in a city that had opinions about everything. Kavitha was easy company in the way of people who dealt with enough genuine emergencies at work that small social frictions didn't register. She asked direct questions and accepted direct answers and didn't require social maintenance beyond the basic human decency of paying attention. She'd asked him once, a few weeks in, if he was seeing anyone. He'd said it was complicated. She'd said, "Is it actually complicated? Or does it just feel that way because you haven't decided yet?" He'd thought about that for a moment and said, "The second one, probably." She'd nodded like this confirmed a theory she'd already had and moved on to a different subject. He told Serena about the conversation later, and she'd laughed in the way she laughed when something was accurate. "She's right," she'd said. "It's not complicated. You've just been being careful." "You've been being careful too," he said. "I know," she said. "I think we're both probably done being careful." That conversation had been 3 weeks ago, and what it had resolved into was not dramatic. It was simply the natural next version of what had already been happening, with less managed distance and more honesty about what it was. They had dinner that wasn't framed as anything except dinner. He met her sister, who was visiting from Portland and who was nothing like Serena in surface presentation and exactly like her in the specific quality of directness, and who had said to Elias after about 40 minutes, "She talks about you like you're a thing she figured out she wanted to keep," which was the most precise description of anything he'd heard in months, and which he'd thought about on the train home with the specific warmth of something landing cleanly. Maya had met her twice, once at the school thing and once in the lobby of the Novatech building when Elias had brought Maya in on a Saturday to pick up a document he'd forgotten. And Serena had been working and had come down to say hello and spent 45 minutes in the lobby talking to Maya about the barrel-eye fish with the full investment of someone who was not performing interest but actually had it. Maya had reported this to Priya as a significant development and had subsequently decided that Serena was pretty good at listening, which was Maya's highest available commendation for an adult. He hadn't rushed that. He wasn't going to rush the next part either. Some things were worth the pace they required. But he knew what he was moving toward, in the unhurried and unambiguous way that you knew things when you'd stopped arguing with yourself about them. On the November Saturday, while the girls finished their cereal and their argument, and the coffee was warm and the city outside was doing its Saturday thing, slower, more human, the version of itself that didn't have anywhere urgent to be, his phone rang. It was Teresa Mack. He hadn't heard from her since the brief email about the sentencing in August, and he hadn't expected to. The investigation had been closed, the findings submitted, the recommendations adopted into the federal protocol review that was now moving through the regulatory process with the grinding inevitability of all regulatory processes. "Carter," she said, "I have something I want to tell you. It's not official, just I wanted you to know." "Okay," he said, and moved to the window where the sound level was lower. "The protocol review," she said, "the one that came out of the Gulfstream investigation. It's been adopted, not in full. These things never get adopted in full. But the core of it. The pre-flight access window documentation, the cowling fastener standardization protocol, the post-clearance security log requirement." A pause. "It goes into effect January 1st. Every commercial and private aviation operation above a certain size federally regulated." He stood at the window with his coffee. "Because of that night," she said. Not sentimentally, factually. Teresa Mack did not deal in sentiment. She dealt in evidence, and this was evidence. Because you stopped and looked at something that wasn't your assignment. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "I did," he said. "Thank you for telling me." After he hung up, he stood at the window for a while. The city outside was going about its Saturday, a man walking a large dog, 2 kids on the sidewalk doing something that involved chalk, the hardware store with the orange awning that he'd passed 100 times now, that had become part of his geography in the way that ordinary things became yours through repetition and presence. He thought about the night, the rain and the runway lights bleeding together, and the cold water in his ear and the socket wrench on his chest. He thought about the 3 fasteners that were a quarter turn short. He thought about how close the margin was between the thing that happened and the thing that almost happened, and how that margin was always thinner than the after-the-fact version made it seem. He thought about all the things you couldn't see coming, the accident on an ordinary morning, the sabotage designed to look like failure, the pattern in a maintenance log that had been waiting 8 months for someone to look at it the right way, the life that turned out to be available on the other side of the life you'd been managing. You couldn't see it coming. You could only be the kind of person who was paying attention when it arrived, who had been paying attention all along, not because you knew what you were looking for, but because looking was what you did. Because the work mattered, or it didn't. And if it did, then the looking mattered. And if the looking mattered, then you did it whether anyone was watching or not. That was the thing you couldn't manufacture. The credential didn't produce it. The title didn't produce it. It came from something older and quieter. From the accumulated habit of caring about the specific thing in front of you, whether the specific thing was a cowling fastener or a maintenance pattern or a daughter's question about why you fixed planes or the person across the table who was telling you something true. Maya appeared at his elbow. "Dad," she said, "Priya says the barrel-eye fish is more significant because it has a transparent head. I said the anglerfish is more significant because it makes its own light." "Who's right?" He looked at his daughter, standing at the window with cereal in her hair and a look of absolute conviction on her face. "You're both right," he said. "Significance isn't a competition." She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Then, "That's kind of a dad answer." "I'm a dad," he said. "It's allowed." She went back to Priya, and he heard her say, "He says we're both right," and Priya say, "That's not a real answer," and Maya say with the exasperation of someone who had been let down by authority, "I know." He smiled and drank his coffee and looked out at the city. Later, he would pick up Maya and Priya from their afternoon art class. A new one, better than the community center one, with a teacher named Mr. Osei who had opinions about color theory that Maya both respected and periodically argued with. He would drop Priya at home. He would make dinner. He would help Maya with homework that was about fractions, which she found deeply philosophically troubling, and he would try to explain that a fraction was just a way of saying that something could be divided and still be itself, and she would look at him like he was speaking a different language, and he would try again differently. In the evening, Serena would come over. Not for any particular reason. They talked about it midweek, nothing formal. She'd said she was free. He'd said come over. She would bring something from the bakery on 57th Street that Maya had decided was the best bakery in the city after a single visit. Maya would be allowed to stay up 45 minutes past her usual bedtime, which she understood was a negotiated exception rather than a precedent, which Serena had said with the specific gravity of someone who had absorbed fairly quickly the importance of not establishing accidental precedents with 7-year-olds. The evening would be ordinary in the ways that ordinary evenings were, which was to say, full of the specific texture of actual life. Someone spilling something, a disagreement about which board game to play that was resolved by playing neither and watching a nature documentary about the deep ocean instead, which Maya narrated with supplemental information that went somewhat beyond what the documentary provided. Serena listening with her legs tucked under her on the couch, laughing at something Maya said about the anglerfish with the full, unguarded quality she had when she wasn't managing how she was perceived. At some point, Maya would fall asleep between them, which was not planned and which neither of them moved to interrupt, because the weight of a sleeping child was the specific gravity of trust, and you didn't redistribute it without reason. The documentary would end, the city would do its night thing outside the window, and they would sit for a while in the lamplit room, the room with the red star hooks, and the refrigerator covered in drawings, and the paper chain turning its second corner, in the easy, undefended quiet of people who had found their way to each other through a storm and a rainstorm and a set of cowling fasteners and months of honest work and the slow, patient accumulation of one true thing after another. He was not the same person he'd been a year ago. Not transformed, not remade. That was not how people actually changed in Elias's experience. People changed incrementally through the accumulation of decisions and their consequences, each one shifting the angle of the next one by a small degree that added up, over time and distance, to something that looked like direction. He'd changed by making a decision to look at something that wasn't his assignment, by saying what he found without softening it, by accepting a life that was different from the life he'd been managing, not because the managed life was bad, but because something in him had recognized that managed was not the same as chosen. He had chosen this. The work and the city and the woman asleep on his couch beside a 7-year-old who had cereal in her hair and strong opinions about bioluminescence. The Thursday meetings and Diane's 12-page proposal and Sasha Kim learning to hold her conclusions one step longer. The work light in his desk drawer and the maintenance journal on the end table and the dinosaur on the lanyard that he still hadn't taken off. The specific, difficult, irreplaceable weight of a life that was actual. Outside, New York was going about its business. Indifferent, enormous, full of people in lit windows navigating their own ordinary, extraordinary lives. None of them knowing, and all of them mattering, in the particular way that mattered most, which was simply that they were there, present and real and continuing. He turned off the lamp. The room went the comfortable dark of a place you knew well enough to navigate without light, and he sat for a moment in it, listening to the breathing of the people asleep beside him and the low ongoing sound of the city outside. And he thought that this exactly, in all its imperfection and all its dailiness and all its hard-won, unspectacular reality, was what he had been, without knowing it, looking for. And he had found it the way he found everything that mattered, by paying attention,